Odo, later known as Bishop Odo of Bayeux and Earl of Kent, was born into a world of Norman ambition around the year 1030 in the Duchy of Normandy, a restless, turbulent land where power was seized by strength, guarded by cunning, and passed through bloodlines both legitimate and otherwise. Hello, my dear sleepy listener. Welcome to Sleepy Crown, where history's quiet tales gently carry you into dreamland. Tonight, we embark on a peaceful journey through the extraordinary life of Odo of Bayeux, a man who stood at the crossroads of church and sword, wielding both the bishop's staff and the warrior's club during one of history's most transformative periods, the Norman conquest of England. We'll softly explore the remarkable story of William the Conqueror's half-brother, from his controversial appointment as bishop at barely 14 years old, through his pivotal role at the Battle of Hastings, to his reign as the second most powerful man in England. We'll discover his commission of the magnificent Bayeux Tapestry, witness his dramatic trial and imprisonment, follow his rebellion against William Rufus, and accompany him on his final journey during the First Crusade. Before you drift away into peaceful slumber, please take a moment to like this video. Leave a gentle comment about which aspect of Odo's complex character fascinates you most, and subscribe to keep these soothing historical tales coming your way. So cozy up, close your eyes, and let these gentle whispers from the 11th century lull you into restful sleep. If you're new here, welcome to the Sleepy Crown family. The Normandy of the early 11th century was not the peaceful duchy that later generations would remember through the soft filter of historical romance. It was a place of stark contrasts and constant violence, where the veneer of Christian civilization overlay something far more primal and dangerous. This was a land where Viking blood still ran hot in Norman veins, where the descendants of Norse raiders who had settled barely a century before still remembered the old ways of their ancestors, the long ships, the sudden raids, the taking of what could be held by force. The landscape itself reflected this character. Norman castles rose from earthen mounds like stone teeth against the sky, their wooden palisades and crude keeps serving as both symbols of authority and practical fortifications against the ever-present threat of violence. Between these strongholds lay a patchwork of fields and forests, villages and monasteries, all held together by the intricate web of feudal obligations that defined medieval society. In this world, a man's worth was measured not in abstract virtues, but in concrete realities. The lands he held, the warriors who followed his banner, the marriages he could arrange for his children, the churches he could endow to secure prayers for his soul. It was a world where noble birth opened doors that remained forever closed to common folk, where bloodlines determined destiny, and where an accident of parentage could mean the difference between lordship and servitude. Into this violent, hierarchical world, a child was born who would one day shake the foundations of England itself. The year was approximately 1030, though the precise date has been lost to the imperfect record-keeping of that distant age. Some historians have suggested it might have been as early as 1030, or as late as 1036, a span of uncertainty that reveals how even the births of those who would become great were not always carefully noted when they seemed unremarkable at the time. This child was named Odo, and his arrival brought together two bloodlines that would prove instrumental in changing the course of English history. His mother was Herleva of Falaise, a woman whose name would echo through the corridors of power for generations to come, though she began life far from any expectation of historical significance. Herleva's father, Fulbert, was a tanner in the town of Falaise, a craftsman who worked with animal hides, transforming them through labor and skill into the leather goods that medieval society required for everything from shoes to saddles, from book bindings to armor straps. It was humble work, honest work, but decidedly not the work of nobility. The tanner's trade, like many crafts that involved handling dead animals, carried a certain social stigma despite its economic importance. Tanners worked with substances that smelled terrible: urine, dung, rotting flesh, and their workshops were typically relegated to the outskirts of towns where the stench would offend as few noses as possible. Yet Heleva possessed something that transcended her father's modest station and the social limitations it imposed. The chroniclers tell us little of her appearance or character, but we can infer much from what we know of her life. She must have possessed beauty, certainly, but also intelligence and presence, qualities that caught the eye of Duke Robert the Fache of Normandy himself, a man who could have had his choice of women. Before Odo's birth, Heleva had been the mistress of Duke Robert, a relationship that in the harsh social calculus of the 11th century was both shameful and prestigious. Shameful because it was outside marriage, because it violated the church's teachings on proper sexual conduct, because it marked Heleva as a woman who had surrendered her virtue, but prestigious too, because her lover was not some minor knight or merchant, but the Duke himself, the most powerful man in Normandy, whose favour could elevate even a tanner's daughter to a position of influence. This relationship had already produced a son before Odo was conceived, a boy born around 1028 who would grow to become one of history's most formidable rulers. That son was William, later known derisively as William the Bastard, due to his illegitimate birth, and later still, after his great triumph, as William the Conqueror. Thus, even before his own birth, Odo was connected to potential greatness through his mother's previous liaison. He would be half-brother to a future king, though neither of them could have known it in those early years when William was just another illegitimate son of a Norman duke, his prospects uncertain, and his very survival in constant doubt. But Heleva's relationship with Duke Robert could not last, no matter how genuine the affection between them might have been. The gulf between their social positions was simply too vast for marriage, at least by the conventions of 11th century Norman society. Duke Robert needed to make a political marriage, one that would bring him alliances with other powerful families, territories, or political advantages. A tanner's daughter, no matter how beautiful or intelligent, could not provide these things. Moreover, Robert's position as Duke required him to present at least a facade of respectability. The church frowned on liaisons with unmarried women, and while powerful nobles routinely ignored such religious scruples, there were limits to how openly they could flaunt them. Eventually, Robert's political obligations and the need for legitimate heirs required him to look elsewhere for a wife. However, Robert was not a man to simply abandon the mother of his son without provision for her future, in what was considered a generous gesture for the time, one that demonstrated both affection for Heleva and concern for William's welfare. Robert arranged for Heleva to marry Herluin of Conteville, a Norman noble of respectable standing. Herluin held the title of Viscount and possessed lands substantial enough to support a family in comfort, if not luxury. He was a man of sufficient rank that marriage to him would provide Heleva with social respectability, and her children with legitimate noble status. This marriage between Heleva and Herluin proved fruitful, producing several children, who would each play significant roles in the Norman conquest and the reshaping of medieval Europe. The chronicles record their names, though details of their early lives remain frustratingly sparse. Odo was one of these children, and he had siblings who would become important figures in their own right. His younger brother was Robert, who would become Count of Mortain. eventually growing into one of the most powerful magnates in the Norman realm. Robert of Mortain would stand beside both William and Odo in the years to come, binding the three half-brothers together in a network of mutual interest and family loyalty that would prove crucial during the conquest of England. Odo also had sisters, though the medieval chroniclers, writing in an age that valued men's deeds over women's lives, tell us less about them. One sister was Emma, who married Richard Le Goz, Viscount of Avranches, thus creating another important political connection for the family. Another daughter, whose name has been lost to history, is sometimes called Muriel in later sources, said to have married William, Seigneur de la Ferté-Macé. These marriages were not love matches in the modern sense, but political arrangements that strengthened the family's network of alliances and obligations across Normandy. Growing up in Herluin's household, young Odo would have been raised with all the expectations and training befitting a Norman noble's son. The education of noble boys in the 11th century was intensely practical, focused on preparing them for their expected roles as warriors and landholders. Odo would have learned to ride almost as soon as he could walk. For a Norman nobleman who could not handle a war horse was almost a contradiction in terms. The destrier, the powerful war horse bred specifically for cavalry charges, was an expensive and temperamental animal that required years of training to master, and noble boys began that training young. He would have learned to handle weapons, the sword, certainly, but also the lance, the mace, the battle axe. He would have practiced hour after hour with wooden weapons first, building the muscles and reflexes necessary for combat before graduating to real steel. He would have learned to fight while wearing armor, to understand how the weight of chainmail restricted movement and how to compensate for that restriction. He would have learned that fighting was not the romantic affair of later literature, but a brutal, exhausting business where victory went to those who combined strength with cunning and who could keep their heads when surrounded by chaos and death. Beyond these martial skills, Odo would have learned to understand the complex web of feudal obligations that bound lord to vassal, protector to protected, the intricate hierarchy that structured all of Norman society. He would have learned that land was not merely property, but the basis of all power, that loyal vassals were worth more than gold, that oaths sworn on holy relics were binding in both this world and the next. He would have witnessed the harsh realities of 11th century Norman life, the constant vigilance required to maintain one's holdings against ambitious neighbors, the swift and often brutal justice meted out to those who challenged authority, the delicate balance of loyalty and self-interest that governed relationships between nobles. He would have seen how disputes were settled, sometimes through negotiation and compensation, but often through violence, with armed men settling their lords' quarrels through combat while priests looked on and prayed. But Odo's childhood was also shaped by something extraordinary, something that set him apart from the younger sons of minor Norman nobles. His connection to his half-brother William, the illegitimate son of Duke Robert, who had, against all odds and in defiance of those who sought his death, survived the treacherous years after his father's death to claim and hold the Duchy of Normandy. William's youth had been marked by constant danger that would have destroyed a weaker person. When Duke Robert died in 1035 during a pilgrimage to Jerusalem, William was only 7 or 8 years old, a child, illegitimate, with powerful nobles who disputed his right to rule. The years that followed were a nightmare of assassination attempts, betrayals, and rebellions. William's guardians and protectors were murdered one by one. The young duke was moved from place to place in secret, hidden from those who sought to kill him and seize the duchy for themselves. That William survived this period at all is remarkable. That he not only survived but eventually consolidated his power speaks to a combination of fortune, ruthlessness, and genuine ability that made him one of the most formidable rulers of the medieval period. By the time Odo was old enough to truly understand politics, William had already demonstrated the iron will and military skill that would later carry him to the throne of England. The relationship between William and his half-siblings appears to have been close, bound by ties of blood and mutual interest that transcended the usual calculations of Norman politics. William, having survived in childhood, where betrayal lurked behind every friendly smile, understood the value of family loyalty in a world where trust was a rare and precious commodity. In Odo, Robert, and their sisters, William saw not just half-siblings, but potential allies, people whose fortunes were tied closely enough to his own that cooperation might be possible, where it would be dangerous with others. For young Odo, William represented both an example and an opportunity. The example was clear. From desperate circumstances, through intelligence and force of will, a man could rise to dominate his enemies and secure his position. Odo watched as William dealt with challenges to his authority, sometimes through negotiation and diplomacy, but often through decisive military action. He learned that power respected strength, that mercy was often interpreted as weakness, that a strong lord who rewarded loyalty and punished betrayal would attract followers even if he was harsh. The opportunity was equally clear. As half-brother to a powerful duke, Odo had access to possibilities that would otherwise have been closed to the younger son of a minor viscount. William's favour could open doors, provide offices, grant lands. If Odo proved himself useful and loyal, there was no telling how high he might rise in his half-brother's service. As Odo grew from childhood into adolescence, he would have watched as William consolidated his power over Normandy through a combination of political acumen and military might. In 1047, when Odo was perhaps 17 years old, William won a decisive victory at the Battle of Valais Dunes, crushing a major rebellion of Norman nobles who had sought to overthrow him. This was no small skirmish, but a pitched battle involving thousands of warriors, a test of William's ability to command men in combat and to outthink enemies who wanted him dead or displaced. The victory at Valais Dunes marked a turning point in William's reign. Before that battle, his hold on the duchy had been precarious, challenged openly by powerful nobles who thought an illegitimate duke could be pushed aside. After that battle, William's position was immeasurably stronger. He had demonstrated that he possessed both the military skill and the ruthless determination necessary to hold power in violent times. Those who had remained neutral during the rebellion now hastened to offer their loyalty. Those who had opposed him openly were defeated, their lands confiscated, their power broken. The young Odo absorbed these lessons well. He saw how power was won and maintained in the 11th century. He witnessed the rewards that came to those who stood with a strong lord at the right time, and the terrible fates that befell those who opposed him. He learned that in the world of Norman politics, strength, loyalty, and ambition were the currencies that mattered most, far more than abstract virtues like mercy or humility. But there was something else stirring in Odo during these formative years, something that would define his entire life and mark him as unusual, even in an age of warrior bishops and militant clergy. Odo was developing a duality of character, a capacity to move between the sacred and the secular, the spiritual and the worldly, with an ease that would both serve him well and ultimately contribute to his downfall. The medieval church was not the institution of pure spirituality that modern minds, shaped by later reforms and centuries of religious change, might imagine. It was deeply enmeshed in the power structures of feudal Europe, controlling vast lands, commanding the labor of thousands of peasants and monks, and wielding influence that could make or break kingdoms. In France alone, the church controlled perhaps a third of all arable land, and the proportion was similar throughout Christian Europe. Bishops were not merely spiritual leaders, concerned only with the salvation of souls and the proper conduct of religious services. They were feudal lords in their own right, owing military service to their secular overlords, maintaining their own armed retinues, collecting taxes and fees from their territories, administering justice in church courts, and engaging in the same politics and power struggles as any other noble. A wealthy bishopric could generate more income than the holdings of many earls and counts, making ecclesiastical offices prizes worth fighting for. The bishops of the early 11th century were typically drawn from the noble classes, often younger sons who could not inherit their father's lands, but who could find position and wealth in the church. These men brought to their religious offices the same attitudes and ambitions that their brothers brought to secular lordship. They maintained armed retainers, built castles on church lands, led troops in battle, negotiated treaties, and accumulated wealth. Some certainly took their spiritual responsibilities seriously, but for many, the bishopric was primarily a political and economic position that happened to require performing religious ceremonies. Yet even in this context, what happened next in Odo's young life was remarkable and would shape both his destiny and the course of events in England for decades to come. In October of 1049, when Odo was at most 19 years old, and possibly as young as 14 if the earlier birth date estimates are correct, William made a decision that demonstrated both the Duke's trust in his half-brother and the pragmatic, calculating nature of 11th century politics. William appointed Odo as Bishop of Bayeux, one of the most important ecclesiastical positions in Normandy. This was an appointment that would have far-reaching consequences, binding Odo's fate to William's, providing the Duke with a trusted ally in a position of great influence, and setting Odo on a path that would lead him to heights of power and depths of disgrace that neither of them could have anticipated. The appointment was extraordinary for several compelling reasons, each of which tells us something important about both Odo's character and the nature of the church in Norman society. First, and most obviously, Odo's age made him exceptionally young for such a position. Bishops were typically mature men with years, sometimes decades, of ecclesiastical training and experience. They were expected to have demonstrated theological knowledge, spiritual wisdom, and administrative competence. The canons of the church specified minimum ages for ordination to various ranks of the clergy, and while these were not always strictly observed, the appointment of a teenager to a bishopric was highly unusual. Second, and perhaps more tellingly, there is little evidence in any of the contemporary sources that Odo had demonstrated any particular spiritual calling or theological aptitude. Unlike some bishops who had spent years in monastic schools studying scripture and theology, unlike those who had shown devotion through lives of prayer and service, Odo appears to have come to his bishopric primarily as a result of his family connection to William. We have no records of him as a particularly pious youth, no stories of religious visions or calling, no evidence of theological education beyond what any noble child might receive as basic religious instruction. What Odo did have, and what William needed, was something that trumped all other considerations: unquestionable loyalty, bound by blood and mutual interest. By placing his half-brother in this powerful position, William secured control over a major ecclesiastical office and its associated wealth and influence. The Bishop of Bayeux controlled extensive lands throughout Normandy, collected revenues from numerous churches and monasteries, had the right to appoint clergy to various positions throughout the diocese, and could mobilize significant resources in support of the Duke's policies. More than just the material resources, however, William was ensuring that one of the key voices in Norman religious and political life would be someone who owed everything to him and whose interests were completely aligned with his own. A bishop appointed from outside the ducal family might develop independent ambitions, might form alliances with other nobles, might even oppose ducal policies if they conflicted with church interests. But Odo, as William's half-brother, could be trusted, also William believed, to support ducal authority without reservation. The appointment was made official at the Council of Reims, a significant gathering of religious and secular leaders where important church business was conducted under the authority of the Pope and his representatives. The formalities were observed. Odo would have taken the vows required of a bishop, sworn to uphold church doctrine and canon law, promised to care for the spiritual welfare of his flock. But everyone understood the political reality beneath these religious ceremonies. This was a calculated move by Duke William to place a trusted ally in a position of power, and Odo's elevation had far more to do with family ties than with spiritual merit. From that moment forward, Odo was no longer simply a Norman noble's son with good family connections. He was Bishop Odo of Bayeux, a prince of the church, a man who wielded spiritual authority over thousands of souls within his diocese, who controlled significant temporal power as well, who could speak with the authority of the church behind him when it suited his purposes. It was a transformation that would have been dizzying for a young man still in his teens, and one that would shape every decision he made for the rest of his long and tumultuous life. Yet despite his new religious role, Odo never seems to have truly embraced the spiritual aspects of his office in any deep or meaningful way. Contemporary chroniclers, writing while Odo lived or shortly after his death, paint a consistent picture of a man far more interested in secular affairs than sacred ones. Even writers who were sympathetic to Odo and to the Norman cause could not entirely disguise his worldly nature. One chronicler, William of Poitiers, attempting to present Odo in the best possible light, noted diplomatically that Odo was known to excel in affairs both ecclesiastical and secular. This was meant as praise, suggesting that Odo was capable of handling both the religious and administrative duties of his office. But even this carefully worded compliment reveals the emphasis of Odo's interests. Throughout his career, the evidence suggests that while he did not entirely neglect his ecclesiastical duties, he did rebuild Bayeux Cathedral, he did attend church councils, he did perform at least the minimum functions required of a bishop. His energy, his passion, and his attention were always focused primarily on the secular side of that equation. Odo's own seal, which he would use to authenticate documents throughout his career, perfectly captured this duality and his own understanding of his role. The seal was not, as one might expect for a bishop, a simple religious symbol. Instead, it was divided into two distinct halves, each telling part of Odo's story. On one side was depicted a bishop in full regalia, holding his staff of office, the crozier that symbolized pastoral authority and spiritual leadership, the shepherd's staff that represented the bishop's duty to guide and protect his flock. This was Odo the churchman, the religious official, the spiritual authority. But on the other side of that same seal was shown a very different figure, a knight bearing a sword, the emblem of martial prowess and worldly power, the weapon of war and violence that was anathema to the peace-loving image of Christianity. This was Odo the warrior, the Norman noble, the secular lord who could command troops and fight in battles, This image was no accident, no artist's whim or symbolic ambiguity. It was a deliberate, calculated representation of how Odo saw himself and wished to be seen by others. He was both bishop and warrior, both cleric and nobleman, moving between these roles with a facility that many contemporaries found troubling, but that Odo himself seemed to find perfectly natural. The seal announced to the world that this was a bishop unlike the contemplative abbots who spent their lives in prayer and study, unlike the reforming clergy who were beginning to call for stricter separation between church and world. This was a bishop who would wear armor as readily as vestments, who would wield weapons as confidently as he blessed the faithful, who would play the game of power politics as skillfully as any secular lord. As Bishop of Bayeux, Odo immediately set about consolidating his position and increasing his wealth and influence. This was standard procedure for 11th century bishops, who were expected to be capable administrators as well as spiritual leaders. One of the first and most visible actions Odo took was to begin ambitious building projects, most notably the reconstruction of Bayeux Cathedral, which had fallen into disrepair. The cathedral at Bayeux was not merely a church building, but a statement of power and authority, a physical manifestation of the bishop's importance and the wealth of his see. Medieval cathedrals were among the largest and most impressive structures in any region, towering over the modest houses and shops that surrounded them, their spires reaching toward heaven in defiance of earthly limitations. To rebuild or expand a cathedral was to make a mark on the physical landscape that would proclaim the builder's importance to future generations long after he had died. This was not purely an act of piety, though Odo and his supporters would certainly have presented it as such. Grand building projects served multiple purposes in medieval society. They demonstrated wealth. Only a rich and powerful man could afford to quarry stone, hire masons and carpenters, purchase the lead for roofs and the glass for windows, and sustain such a project over years or even decades. They provided employment for craftsmen and laborers, creating a network of dependents who owed their livelihoods to the bishop's patronage. They enhanced the prestige of the diocese, making it more impressive to visiting dignitaries and more attractive to pilgrims whose offerings enriched the church treasury. The reconstruction of Bayeux Cathedral would take years to complete, consuming enormous resources and the labor of hundreds of workers. Stone had to be quarried and transported, often from distant sites. Master masons had to design the structure, ensuring that it would be both beautiful and sound, that the walls would support the weight of the roof, that the arches would distribute stress properly. Carpenters had to create the elaborate roof timbers. Glaziers had to produce the colored glass for windows. Artists had to design and execute frescoes, sculptures, and other decorations. It was a massive undertaking that would define much of Odo's early years as bishop. But even as he attended to these ecclesiastical duties, Odo was being drawn deeper into his half-brother's increasingly ambitious plans. William's secure hold on Normandy was proving to be merely a foundation for greater ambitions. The Duke had married well in approximately 1051, taking as his wife Matilda of Flanders, a woman whose lineage was impeccable and whose family connections strengthened William's position significantly. Despite initial papal opposition, Pope Leo IX had forbidden the marriage on grounds of consanguinity. Matilda and William were distantly related. The couple had wed anyway, and eventually received papal dispensation, regularizing their union and legitimizing their growing family of sons and daughters. William was consolidating power, building alliances, demonstrating that he could be both a faithful vassal to the French king, to whom he owed nominal allegiance as Duke of Normandy, and a ruthless enemy to anyone who challenged him. He was becoming respected and feared beyond Normandy's borders. His reputation as a capable military commander and shrewd politician spreading throughout France and beyond. And across the English Channel lay a prize that glittered ever more brightly in Norman eyes. The Kingdom of England itself, rich in land and resources, troubled by succession questions, connected to Normandy through ties of blood and decades of cultural exchange. William had family connections to the English royal house. His great-aunt Emma of Normandy had been Queen of England, mother of King Edward the Confessor, who now sat on England's throne. And Edward, growing old without children of his own, would need to designate a successor. William intended to ensure that he was that successor, by persuasion if possible, by force if necessary. Odo, as Bishop of Bayeux and as William's half-brother, would be intimately involved in the planning and execution of this grand ambition. But before we follow him across the Channel to conquest and glory, we must understand more fully the world he inhabited, the Norman society that produced such remarkable warriors, and the intricate web of feudal relationships and church politics that made possible one of the most audacious military ventures of the medieval period. To truly understand Odo's role in the events that would unfold, to appreciate the magnitude of what William and his followers were planning, we must pause for a moment in our narrative and consider more deeply the nature of Norman society in the years leading up to 1066. The Normans were a distinctive people, neither quite French nor quite Scandinavian, but rather a unique fusion of both cultures that had emerged in the generations since Viking raiders first settled along the northern coast of France. The name Norman itself derives from Northmen, the term used for the Scandinavian raiders who had terrorized the coasts of Europe throughout the 9th and 10th centuries. In 911, a Viking leader named Rollo had negotiated an extraordinary treaty with the French king Charles the Simple. In exchange for ceasing his raids and providing a buffer against other Viking incursions, Rollo was granted a substantial territory along the northern French coast, the region that would become known as Normandy. Rollo and his followers converted to Christianity, at least nominally, and began to adopt French language, customs, and feudal organization. But they did not entirely abandon their Scandinavian heritage. The result, by Odo's time more than a century later, was a society that combined the organizational efficiency and feudal hierarchy of French society with something of the Viking spirit, the seafaring traditions, the warrior culture, the willingness to take tremendous risks for the chance of enormous rewards. Norman society was intensely hierarchical, organized according to the principles of feudalism that were spreading throughout Western Europe. At the top was the Duke, in this case William, who held ultimate authority over all the lands and people of Normandy. Below him were his tenants-in-chief, the earls, counts, and major bishops, who held large territories directly from the Duke in exchange for military service, counsel, and loyalty. These great lords, in turn, had their own vassals, knights who held smaller estates in return for military service to their lord. This feudal pyramid was held together by oaths of loyalty that were considered sacred. When a vassal swore fealty to his lord, placing his hands between the lord's hands and promising to serve faithfully, this was not merely a legal contract, but a solemn vow sworn before God. Breaking such an oath was not just a political betrayal, but a spiritual crime that imperiled one's immortal soul. The entire system depended on these oaths being taken seriously, on men honoring their word even when doing so was costly or dangerous. But feudalism was more than just a military and political system. It was also the economic foundation of medieval society. Land was the basis of all wealth in an age before significant trade or industry. The great estates that nobles held produced food through the labor of peasants who worked the fields, raised livestock, and paid various fees and rents to their lords. A powerful noble like Bishop Odo controlled not just military forces, but also mills where grain was ground, ovens where bread was baked, forests where timber could be harvested, rivers where fish could be caught, all sources of revenue and power. The church, meanwhile, was completely integrated into this feudal system. Bishops and abbots held lands just like secular lords and owed the same military service. A wealthy monastery might control dozens of manors, hundreds of peasants, and be required to provide knights for the duke's army, just like any earl or count. The distinction between sacred and secular was far less clear than modern people might imagine. The same man, like Odo, could be both a spiritual leader responsible for souls and a feudal lord commanding troops in battle. The 1050s and early 1060s were years of relative peace in Normandy, at least by the violent standards of the age. William had consolidated his power through the victory at Valais Dunes and subsequent campaigns, crushing or co-opting those nobles who might have challenged him. His marriage to Matilda of Flanders in approximately 1051 had given him valuable political connections to one of the wealthiest and most powerful territories in the Low Countries. Flanders controlled important trade routes and had resources that complemented Normandy's strengths. The marriage had initially been controversial. Pope Leo IX had forbidden it on the grounds that William and Matilda were related within the prohibited degrees of consanguinity. They were reportedly fifth cousins, close enough that canon law at the time prohibited their marriage. But William and Matilda had gone ahead with the wedding anyway, an act of defiance that demonstrated William's willingness to place political necessity above strict adherence to church law. The papal prohibition had created an awkward situation. William and Matilda were technically excommunicated, their marriage not recognized by the church, their children theoretically illegitimate, but pragmatic considerations eventually prevailed. William was too powerful to simply ignore, and the church needed the support of strong rulers. In 1059, Pope Nicholas II lifted the excommunication and granted a dispensation for the marriage, legitimizing it retroactively. As penance, and as a shrewd investment in their soul's welfare, William and Matilda each founded a monastery in Caen. William's foundation was the Abbaye aux Hommes, men's abbey, while Matilda founded the Abbaye aux Dames, ladies' abbey. Both would become important centers of Norman religious life. By the early 1060s, William and Matilda had produced a growing family that seemed to promise stability for the dynasty. Their sons included Robert Curthose, born around 1051, who would eventually cause his father considerable grief, but who, in these early years, seemed destined to inherit the duchy. William Rufus, born around 1056, showed signs of his father's ruthless capability even as a child. Henry, born around 1068, was still to come, but the family was expanding in ways that suggested the Norman dynasty would continue for generations. During these years, Odo settled into his role as Bishop of Bayeux, though settled is perhaps too mild a word for the energetic and ambitious young prelate. He was learning the craft of administration, managing the extensive lands and resources of his diocese, adjudicating disputes, appointing clergy to various positions, collecting revenues, and performing at least the minimal ceremonial functions expected of a bishop. He attended various church councils where matters of ecclesiastical policy and politics were debated and decided. The records show him present at important gatherings at Rouen in 1055, 1061, and 1063. These councils dealt with various issues, disputed appointments to church offices, questions of doctrine, conflicts between monasteries over property or privileges, and the relationship between church and secular authority. Odo's name appears on various charters and documents from this period, always among the list of important witnesses whose presence lent authority and legitimacy to important transactions. In 1059, demonstrating both his wealth and his desire to be seen as a proper ecclesiastical patron, Odo founded the Abbey of Traun, a monastery that would serve as a centre of learning and religious life. The foundation of monasteries was a common activity for wealthy churchmen and nobles in the medieval period, motivated by a complex mixture of genuine piety, concern for one's immortal soul, and desire for worldly reputation. A monastery was far more than just a religious institution. It was an economic engine, managing agricultural estates that could extend over miles of countryside. Monasteries employed scores of workers, lay brothers who performed manual labor, servants who maintained the buildings, craftsmen who produced everything from illuminated manuscripts to cheese and wine. They were also cultural centers, maintaining libraries, copying manuscripts that preserved ancient knowledge, educating the sons of nobles, and providing hospitality to travelers. For the founder of a monastery, there were multiple benefits. Most immediately, it was an act of piety that would earn spiritual merit and demonstrate proper concern for religious matters, important for a bishop who might otherwise be seen as too worldly. The monks would pray for the founder's soul both during his life and after his death, a kind of spiritual insurance policy in an age when the afterlife was a very real concern for even the most worldly men. But there were also practical advantages. A monastery founded by Odo would be loyal to him, its abbot appointed by him, or at least with his approval. It would serve as a power base, a place where his supporters could be rewarded with positions, where valuable items could be stored for safekeeping, where he could retreat if political circumstances required it. The monastery and its lands would generate revenue, some of which would flow back to the bishop's coffers through various arrangements. The Abbey of Traun joined a network of monasteries and religious houses across Normandy, each with its own history, its own particular customs and traditions, its own relationships with secular and ecclesiastical powers. These institutions were not isolated but formed a complex web of connections. Monks might move from one house to another. Abbots corresponded about theological questions or administrative problems. Monasteries collaborated or competed for patronage and resources. Yet, for all these conventional activities expected of a bishop, Odo's true interests always seemed to lie more in the secular realm than the sacred. He was present at his half-brother's court for important political decisions, consulted on matters of strategy and governance, included in the inner circle of advisors who helped William navigate the complex politics of 11th century France and the duchy's relationships with neighboring territories. He was learning statecraft, absorbing the lessons of power that would serve him well in the years ahead. He watched how William handled disputes between vassals, how he balanced competing interests among his nobles, how he used a combination of rewards and punishments to maintain loyalty. He observed how marriages could create alliances, how strategic grants of land could bind powerful families to ducal interests, how a reputation for swift and certain punishment could deter challenges to authority. William's court was a remarkable institution, a blend of formal ceremony and practical governance. When the Duke held court, whether at his primary residence in Rouen or at one of his other castles, the great nobles of Normandy would gather to render counsel, settle disputes, witness important documents, and demonstrate their loyalty through attendance. These gatherings were not merely social occasions, but essential mechanisms of governance in a system where personal relationships and face-to-face contact were crucial to maintaining political order. At these gatherings, Odo learned to navigate the intricate protocols of court life. He learned who was allied with whom, which nobles nursed grievances against each other, who could be trusted, and who merely played at loyalty while pursuing their own interests. He learned that information was valuable, that knowing what others planned before they acted could mean the difference between success and failure. He developed networks of informants and supporters, men who owed him favors or sought his patronage, who would keep him informed of developments even when he was not personally present. But even as Odo mastered the politics of Normandy, his attention, like William's, was increasingly drawn across the English Channel to developments in England that would soon create the opportunity for the greatest adventure of their lives. The Kingdom of England in the 1050s and early 1060s was in a peculiar state, wealthy and relatively peaceful on the surface, but with profound political instability lurking beneath. King Edward the Confessor, who had ruled England since 1042, was a complex and somewhat enigmatic figure. He'd spent much of his youth in exile in Normandy, driven from England by the Danish kings who had conquered the realm. Those years in Normandy had shaped him profoundly. He spoke French as fluently as English, understood Norman customs and politics, and had developed close relationships with Norman nobles, including with William's family. Edward's mother, Emma of Normandy, was William's great-aunt, creating a family connection between the English royal house and the Norman ducal family. When Edward finally returned to England and claimed the throne in 1042, after the Danish royal line had failed, he brought with him Norman favourites and advisors. This created tensions with powerful English nobles, particularly the Godwinson family, who resented foreign influence at the English court. Earl Godwin of Wessex and his sons, Harold, Tostig, Gurth, Leofwine, and others, were the most powerful family in England, controlling vast territories and commanding the loyalty of numerous thegns, English lesser nobles, and warriors. The Godwinsons and Edward had a complicated relationship, marked by periods of cooperation and open conflict. In 1051, tensions had exploded into a crisis when Edward attempted to move against Godwin's power. The Earl and his family had been forced into temporary exile, but they returned in 1052 with an armed force, and Edward had been compelled to restore their lands and positions. From that point forward, it was clear that the Godwinsons were the real power behind the throne, with the king having limited ability to act independently of their interests. To further complicate matters, Edward and his wife Edith, who was Earl Godwin's daughter, produced no children despite decades of marriage. Whether this was due to Edward's reputed piety and possible celibacy, to medical issues, or to political calculations about not wanting to bind the throne to the Godwinson line, remains unclear. But the result was that by the early 1060s, as Edward entered his 60s, the succession question loomed increasingly large. Medieval succession was not as straightforward as modern hereditary systems. While there was generally a presumption that the throne should pass to close relatives of the previous king, the actual selection was often made by an assembly of the most powerful nobles, in England's case, the Witenagemot, a council of bishops, earls, and other important men. This meant that the succession could be influenced by political maneuvering, by deals struck between powerful families, by the ability of candidates to present themselves as viable rulers. William of Normandy had what he considered a strong claim to the English throne. His great-aunt Emma had been Queen of England twice, first as wife to King Ethelred the Unready and mother of Edward the Confessor, then as wife to King Canute the Great of Denmark during the period of Danish rule. This gave William a blood connection to the English royal family, though admittedly not a particularly close one by the standards of modern genealogy. More importantly, from the Norman perspective, was the claim that Edward had actually promised William the throne. According to Norman sources, Edward had designated William as his heir, recognizing their family connection and William's status as a powerful ruler capable of maintaining England's stability. Whether such a promise was actually made, and under what circumstances, remains one of the great disputed questions of medieval history. English sources are largely silent on any such promise, while Norman sources assert it emphatically. What is clearer is that Norman influence at Edward's court provided opportunities for William to cultivate relationships with key figures in England and to stay informed about political developments. Norman clerics held important positions in the English church. Norman knights and nobles received lands and offices. Norman merchants traded in English ports. All of this created channels of communication and influence that William could exploit. Then, in 1064, an event occurred that would become central to the Norman justification for invasion, immortalized in the Bayeux Tapestry and debated by historians ever since. Harold Godwinson, Earl of Wessex and the most powerful nobleman in England, travelled to Normandy and met with William. The circumstances of this visit remain mysterious. Why Harold went, what he intended to accomplish, and what actually transpired during his time in Normandy are all subject to different interpretations by Norman and English sources. According to the Norman version of events, as depicted in the Bayeux Tapestry and recounted by Norman chroniclers, Edward had sent Harold to Normandy specifically to confirm to William that he would be Edward's successor. Harold was to swear an oath to William, promising to support the Norman duke's claim when Edward died. The tapestry shows Harold placing his hands on holy relics while taking this oath, making it particularly sacred and binding. But the oath, according to Norman sources, came with strings attached. Harold agreed not only to support William's succession, but also to marry one of William's daughters, thus binding the Godwinson and Norman families together, and to surrender Dover Castle to Norman control as soon as he returned to England, giving William a foothold in England even before Edward's death. These were substantial commitments that would have effectively subordinated English interest to Norman control. English sources, on the other hand, present a very different version of events when they mention the visit at all. Some suggest that Harold's journey to Normandy was not intentional, but the result of being blown off course during a fishing expedition or sea voyage. Others suggest that Harold was on a different mission entirely, perhaps seeking the release of family members who were being held hostage in Normandy. In these versions, any oath Harold might have sworn was made under duress, extracted by William while Harold was essentially a prisoner, and therefore not binding. The truth likely lies somewhere between these partisan accounts. It seems probable that Harold did visit Normandy in 1064, that he did meet with William, and that some kind of oath or promise was exchanged. But the exact nature of that oath, the circumstances under which it was given, and whether Harold considered it binding, all remain matters of interpretation and debate. What matters for our story is that William treated the oath as absolutely binding and sacred. From the Norman perspective, Harold had made a solemn promise, sworn on holy relics, to support William's claim to the English throne. If Harold later violated that oath by claiming the throne for himself, he would be an oath-breaker, a perjurer whose word could not be trusted, whose violation of sacred vows made him an enemy not just of William, but of God himself. This moral dimension to the dispute was crucial. Medieval warfare was not simply about competing territorial claims or political interests. It was also about honor, legitimacy, and divine favor. If William could present his invasion of England as the righteous punishment of an oath-breaker, if he could claim that God favored his cause because Harold had violated sacred vows, then the invasion became something more than mere conquest. It became a crusade, a holy war, an act of divine justice. Then, in January of 1066, events moved rapidly toward their climax. King Edward the Confessor, who had been failing in health for some time, died at Westminster. He was in his early 60s, quite old by medieval standards, and his death had been expected. But the succession question that had loomed over English politics for years now had to be resolved immediately. Within hours of Edward's death, perhaps even before he had actually expired, the Witenagemot assembled and proclaimed Harold Godwinson as king. Harold was crowned the very next day at Westminster Abbey, an unseemly haste that suggests the decision had been made well in advance, and that Harold and his supporters wanted to present the Norman and other potential claimants with a fait accompli. From the Norman perspective, this was an outrageous usurpation. William claimed that Edward's promise to him still stood, that Harold's oath to support that promise was binding, and that Harold's acceptance of the crown violated both Edward's wishes and Harold's own sworn word. Whether these Norman claims were entirely justified or were partly propaganda designed to provide moral cover for what was essentially a war of conquest, they served their purpose. William now had both a claim to the English throne and a moral justification for pursuing that claim through force of arms. But having a claim and actually being able to enforce it were two very different things. An invasion of England would be one of the most audacious military undertakings of the entire medieval period. It would require building a fleet large enough to transport thousands of warriors and their horses across the treacherous waters of the English Channel. It would require those warriors to commit to a campaign whose success was far from guaranteed, in a foreign land where they would be vastly outnumbered by the English population. It would require provisions, equipment, money, and above all, the willingness of Norman nobles to risk everything on William's ambition. William called for a great council to be held at Lillebonne, a gathering of all the major Norman nobles to discuss the proposed invasion. This was not a mere formality. William genuinely needed his nobles' support. He could not invade England with only his own household troops. He needed the armed retinues of his great vassals, the knights and soldiers they commanded, the ships they could provide, and those nobles had to be convinced that the risks were worth taking, that the potential rewards justified leaving their Norman lands, potentially vulnerable to attack, while they sailed off to conquer a foreign kingdom. The Council of Lillebonne was contentious, with debates that reportedly went on for days. Many Norman nobles were deeply reluctant to commit to such a risky venture. The invasion would require an enormous fleet, not just warships for combat, but transport vessels capable of carrying not only warriors, but horses, armor, provisions, and all the material of war across the unpredictable waters of the English Channel. Medieval ships were not the reliable vessels of later ages. They depended entirely on wind and current, could not sail effectively into the wind, and were vulnerable to storms that could scatter a fleet or sink ships wholesale. Even if they successfully crossed the Channel, the invaders would face a hostile kingdom with a strong military tradition. English armies had successfully defended against invasions for centuries. The English Fyrd, a militia system that could call up thousands of armed men from across the kingdom, gave Harold access to military forces that potentially far outnumbered anything William could bring. The English Navy controlled the channel, or could potentially do so if properly deployed. The risks were enormous, and many nobles at Lillebonne argued that the whole venture was impossibly dangerous. It was at this council that Odo truly began to emerge as one of the key figures in the Norman enterprise. He wasn't merely present as Bishop of Bayeux, fulfilling his feudal obligation to attend his lord's council. He was an active, enthusiastic participant, one of the strongest voices arguing in favor of the invasion. While more cautious nobles hesitated and raised objections, Odo spoke forcefully about the opportunities that success would bring and the regrets that would haunt those who refused to participate in such a grand enterprise. His support carried weight for several reasons. First, as William's half-brother, his backing demonstrated family unity and suggested that William's closest kin believed the venture would succeed. Second, as a bishop, his endorsement lent a degree of religious legitimacy to the enterprise. If a prince of the church supported the invasion, it suggested that God's favor might rest with William's cause. Third, Odo was willing to back his words with concrete commitments. According to the chronicles from the period, Odo pledged to provide 100 ships for the invasion fleet, an enormous contribution that demonstrated both his wealth and his commitment to the venture. These would not be small fishing boats or coastal vessels, but substantial ships capable of carrying armed men, horses, and equipment across the channel. Building or acquiring 100 such ships represented a massive investment of resources, requiring the labor of shipwrights and carpenters, the harvesting of timber from forests, the production of sailcloth, ropes, and all the other materials necessary for seaworthy vessels. The cost would have been staggering, perhaps equivalent to several years' income from his bishoprics' estates. But Odo was gambling that the potential rewards would far exceed the investment. If William succeeded in conquering England, those who had supported him would receive vast estates carved from the lands of defeated English nobles. Odo could envision himself not just as Bishop of Bayeux, but as one of the great magnates of a new Norman English realm, wielding power in England far beyond anything possible in Normandy alone. Other nobles, seeing that powerful figures like Odo were committed to the plan, gradually came around to supporting it. William promised rewards from the conquered land, titles, estates, and privileges for those who fought beside him. The Duke also took the brilliant step of seeking and obtaining a papal banner from Pope Alexander II, lending the invasion the aura of a holy crusade against the perjurer Harold. This was not just a war of conquest, but a religious mission approved by the Church, fighting against a man who had violated sacred oaths. The Pope's support was crucial for several reasons. It provided moral legitimacy in an age when religious authority carried enormous weight. It meant that clergy throughout Europe could be expected to support William's cause, or at least not oppose it. It suggested that God favored William's claim, that divine providence would aid the Norman cause, and practically, it meant that church resources, including the wealth of bishoprics and monasteries that might otherwise have remained neutral, could be mobilized to support the invasion. Slowly, surely, the invasion force began to take shape. Individual nobles pledged ships and men. William's own resources were mobilized. Timber was cut from ducal forests. Shipwrights were employed in ducal shipyards. Provisions were collected from ducal estates. Across Normandy, the spring and summer of 1066 saw a level of military preparation that the duchy had never before witnessed. Throughout the spring and summer of 1066, the Norman coast became a hive of extraordinary activity, unlike anything seen in the living memory. The beaches and harbours of Normandy, from Dives-sur-Mer to Saint-Valery-sur-Somme, echoed with the sounds of construction, organisation, and military preparation. on a scale that seemed almost impossible for a duchy that, just a generation earlier, had been torn by civil war and rebellion. Trees were felled across Norman forests, oak for the frames and keels of ships, pine for masts, various hardwoods for planking and decking. These were not the sophisticated vessels of later centuries, but rather adaptations of traditional Viking ship designs that the Normans still remembered from their Scandinavian ancestors. Long, sleek hulls with shallow drafts that could navigate rivers and beach on coastlines. Single square sails that would catch the wind and drive the vessels forward. Room for rowers who could propel the ships when the wind failed. And crucially, space for cargo. Not just warriors, but horses, armor, weapons, provisions, and all the equipment necessary for an army to function in hostile territory. The shipwrights worked from dawn until dusk, their axes and adzes shaping timber into the curved strakes that would form the hulls, drilling holes for the iron rivets that would hold the planking together, caulking the seams with tar and animal hair to make them watertight. Each ship represented weeks or months of skilled labor, and William needed hundreds of them. The chronicles suggest that the final invasion fleet numbered somewhere between 400 and 700 vessels. The exact number is disputed, but all sources agree it was massive by the standards of the age. While the ships were being built, other preparations moved forward simultaneously. Weapons had to be manufactured or collected from across Normandy and beyond. Swords, expensive, high-quality weapons that only the wealthy could afford, forged from steel in a time when metallurgy was still as much art as science. Spears and lances by the thousands, their ash shafts straight and strong, their iron heads sharp and deadly. Axes, both the Danish-style battle axes favoured by many warriors and the smaller hand axes that every soldier carried for cutting firewood and performing camp tasks. Bows and arrows, longbows of yew wood, crossbows with their mechanical cranks and triggers, thousands upon thousands of arrows with iron heads and feathered flights. Armor represented an enormous investment of resources and craftsmanship. The primary armor of the period was chainmail, thousands of tiny iron rings interlocked to form a flexible protective garment that could stop or deflect sword cuts and many arrow strikes. A single coat of mail, called a hauberk, required tens of thousands of individual rings, each one carefully forged and linked to its neighbors. The work was tedious and time-consuming, requiring skilled craftsmen who understood how to create mail that was both protective and flexible enough to allow movement. A knight's complete set of armor might take months to produce and cost as much as a good farm. Beyond the weapons and armor, the invasion force needed provisions on a scale that challenged the agricultural capacity of Normandy. An army of 7,000 men would consume enormous quantities of food every day. Grain had to be collected and milled into flour, then baked into hardtack. Hard, dry bread that would keep for weeks or months without spoiling. Salted meat and fish that could survive the sea voyage and the uncertain supplies situation in hostile territory. Cheese, dried fruit, beans, and other preserved foods. Wine and water in barrels, though the water would quickly become brackish and foul, while wine kept better during transport. The horses presented their own logistical challenge. Medieval war horses, destriers, were valuable animals, expensive to purchase and train, requiring special care and substantial amounts of food. Each war horse might consume 20 pounds of grain and hay per day, plus water. With 2,000 cavalry planned for the invasion, the horses alone would require 40,000 pounds of fodder daily. This meant the invasion fleet had to carry not just provisions for men, but tons of grain and hay for the horses, or plan to seize these supplies immediately upon landing in England. Odo was deeply involved in all these preparations, using his position and wealth to help gather the resources necessary for this unprecedented undertaking. His contribution of 100 ships represented perhaps a fifth of the entire fleet, an enormous investment that demonstrated his commitment to William's cause and his belief in the ultimate success of the venture. But beyond the ships themselves, Odo helped organize the collection of provisions from church lands, used his ecclesiastical authority to encourage other bishops and monasteries to support the invasion, and employed his administrative skills to help manage the complex logistics of preparing such a force. As Bishop of Bayeux, Odo controlled extensive estates across Normandy, each manor and farm producing grain, livestock, timber, and other resources that could be directed toward the invasion effort. He could command labor from the peasants who worked church lands, requiring them to provide service cutting timber, building ships, transporting supplies, and performing the countless tasks necessary to prepare an invasion force. His position gave him access to resources that a secular noble of equivalent rank might not have been able to mobilize as easily. Throughout these months of preparation, messengers traveled constantly between Normandy and England, gathering intelligence about Harold's preparations, the disposition of English forces, the state of coastal defenses, and potential landing sites. William needed to know where he could land his fleet, where he might find supplies in England, what resistance he would face, and where Harold's army was positioned. This intelligence gathering was crucial. Landing in the wrong place, or at a time when Harold's full army was waiting on the beaches, could doom the entire enterprise before it truly began. The spring passed into summer, and still the preparations continued. The sheer scale of the undertaking required more time than William had initially hoped. Ships had to be completed, tested, and repaired when flaws were discovered. Provisions had to be collected from the late summer harvest. Warriors had to be assembled from across Normandy and beyond, for William had cast his recruitment net wide, promising land and plunder to adventurers from Brittany, Flanders, France, and even more distant regions. The army that would eventually cross the Channel would be Norman in leadership and core forces, but it would include fighting men from across Western Europe, all drawn by the promise of wealth and land in conquered England. By early September 1066, the fleet was finally ready. Hundreds of ships gathered at the port of Dives-sur-Mer, their masts creating a forest of timber along the Norman coast. The army assembled was impressive by any standard of the age. Perhaps 7,000 men in total, including approximately 2,000 cavalry. The cavalry were the elite troops, mounted warriors whose charge could break infantry formations that foot soldiers alone could not penetrate. Each knight represented years of training, expensive equipment, a war horse worth a small fortune, and the military tradition of the Norman warrior class. The infantry included both professional soldiers, household troops maintained year-round by nobles and maintained through their lord's wealth, and feudal levies, men called up from their farms and villages for military service as part of their obligations to their lords. Some were well equipped with mail armor and good weapons, while others carried little more than spears and leather jerkins. The quality varied considerably, but all had been gathered for this singular purpose, the conquest of England. But having assembled this impressive force, William now faced a challenge he could not overcome through military skill or political maneuvering. The weather. The English Channel is one of the most treacherous bodies of water in Europe, subject to sudden storms, strong currents, and winds that can shift direction with dangerous speed. Medieval ships could not sail effectively into the wind. They needed favorable winds from the south or east to carry them across the Channel from Normandy to England. And in early September, the winds were not favorable. Day after day, the army waited at Dives-sur-Mer, consuming provisions, growing restless, while the wind blew from the wrong direction. For a medieval army, waiting was almost as dangerous as fighting. Men crowded together in unsanitary conditions spread disease. Horses required constant care and enormous amounts of fodder. Provisions that had been stockpiled for the invasion were consumed while the army sat idle. Morale could deteriorate as men wondered whether the invasion would ever happen, whether God's apparent refusal to provide favorable winds meant divine disfavor for William's cause. The delay was also strategically problematic. Every day that passed allowed Harold more time to prepare England's defences, to position his forces, to repair ships, and strengthen coastal fortifications. Harold knew the invasion was coming. The Norman preparations had been too extensive to keep secret, and English spies and merchants travelling in Normandy had carried word back across the Channel. Harold had mobilised the English fyrd and positioned forces along the southern coast, watching and waiting for the Norman fleet to appear. William faced difficult decisions. Should he wait indefinitely for favourable winds, risking the disintegration of his army through disease, desertion, and consumed supplies? Should he risk a crossing in unfavourable conditions, potentially losing ships and men to storms? Should he abandon the attempt entirely for this year and try again the following spring? Each option carried enormous risks. During this period of waiting, Odo's role as both bishop and military leader became particularly important. As a bishop, he could offer spiritual reassurance to troops who might see the unfavourable winds as a sign of divine displeasure. He could lead prayers for good weather, perform religious services to maintain morale, and use his ecclesiastical authority to encourage patience and faith in God's ultimate favour for their cause. As a military leader and William's half-brother, he could help enforce discipline, prevent desertion, organise the distribution of dwindling supplies, and keep the assembled nobles from quarrelling among themselves. Medieval armies were always volatile organisations, held together by personal loyalty, feudal obligation, and the expectation of reward. Nobles who had pledged ships and men did so because they expected to benefit from the invasion's success. But as the weeks of waiting stretched on, some began to question whether success was possible. Odo had to use all his skills of persuasion and his authority to keep the coalition together, to prevent nobles from deciding to take their forces home rather than continue waiting for winds that might never come. Finally, after weeks of frustration, William made the decision to move the fleet from Dives-sur-Mer to Saint-Valery-sur-Somme, a harbour further north along the Norman coast. This move served several purposes. It positioned the fleet closer to England, reducing the distance that would need to be covered once favourable winds finally came. It provided a change of scenery and activity that helped maintain morale among the troops who had been sitting idle for so long. And pragmatically, the area around Saint-Valery might offer better foraging opportunities for the horses and men who had consumed the supplies originally collected at Dives. The move was not without risks. Moving an entire fleet and army along the coast required careful coordination and invited disaster if storms arose during the relocation. Ships had to stay together, avoiding collisions and groundings. Cavalry had to travel overland with their horses, while the infantry and supplies moved by sea. But the move was accomplished successfully, and by mid-September, the invasion force had repositioned itself at Saint-Valery-sur-Somme, still waiting for the wind to shift. And then they waited some more. September advanced toward its end, and still the winds remained unfavourable. The invasion season was rapidly closing. October weather in the Channel would be even more treacherous than September. with the increasing risk of storms that could destroy the fleet entirely. Some among William's advisors suggested that the invasion should be abandoned for the year, that they should disperse the army and try again the following spring, when conditions would be more favorable. But William was determined to proceed. He had invested too much, risked too much, promised too much to simply abandon the attempt. His reputation was at stake. If he disbanded the army without even attempting the invasion, he would look weak and indecisive. Some of his nobles might refuse to muster again the following year, arguing that they had already fulfilled their feudal obligations. The momentum that had been built through months of preparation and the Pope's endorsement might be lost. Harold would have an entire winter to strengthen England's defences. No, William decided. They would wait for the wind to shift, and when it did, they would sail immediately, regardless of how late in the season it had become. Then, on the night of September 27, 1066, after weeks of agonizing delay, the wind finally shifted. It came from the south, blowing from Normandy toward England. Exactly what the fleet needed. Orders went out immediately. They would sail that very night, taking advantage of the favorable conditions before the wind could shift again. There was no time to lose, no opportunity for second thoughts or prolonged farewells. The army boarded the ships in darkness, a chaotic process of getting thousands of men, hundreds of horses, and tons of equipment onto vessels and preparing to cast off. Horses were particularly difficult to manage, nervous animals being led onto ships in the dark, secured in makeshift stalls, where they would stand for hours during the crossing, unable to lie down or move freely. The war horses were valuable and temperamental, requiring careful handling to prevent injuries or panic that could endanger the ships. William's personal ship, the Mora, a gift from his wife Matilda, would lead the fleet. It was larger and finer than most of the invasion vessels, and its lantern, hung from the mast, would serve as a beacon for the other ships to follow through the darkness. The crossing would be made at night, a dangerous proposition, but one that offered advantages. It would be more difficult for English coastal watchers to spot the fleet approaching. It would mean arriving in England at dawn, when the defenders would be least prepared, and the darkness would help conceal the true size of the fleet from any English ships that might be patrolling the channel. Odo was aboard one of those ships, crossing the channel with the invasion force, his role as both bishop and warrior about to be tested in the most dramatic fashion possible. As a bishop, he had spiritual responsibilities to the men who were making this dangerous journey, trusting in God's protection as they sailed across treacherous waters in darkness. As a warrior noble and William's half-brother, he had practical responsibilities to help organize and lead the forces, to be ready to fight when they reached English shores. The crossing itself was a remarkable feat of navigation and coordination. In an age without compasses, without accurate maps, without any of the navigational instruments that later sailors would take for granted, the fleet had to maintain formation in darkness while crossing perhaps 90 miles of open water. The pilots, experienced sailors who knew the channel, guided the vessels by the stars when they were visible, by the swells and currents of the water, by instinct and experience gained over years of coastal sailing. The crossing was accomplished in a single night, testimony to favorable conditions and skilled seamanship. According to the chronicles, William's ship actually arrived at the English coast ahead of the rest of the fleet. This created a moment of anxiety. William found himself on the beach with only his immediate household troops, temporarily separated from the main invasion force. But gradually, as dawn broke over the channel, more ships appeared on the horizon, then more, until the entire fleet had successfully made the crossing with minimal losses to storms or accidents. It was an extraordinary achievement. a successful amphibious operation that demonstrated the planning and organizational capacity that would characterize the entire Norman conquest. They landed at Pevensey on the morning of September 28, 1066, meeting no resistance on the beaches. This was both good fortune and good intelligence. Harold had indeed mobilized English forces to defend the coast, stationing troops at likely landing sites and keeping the fyrd under arms throughout the summer. But Harold faced a problem that William did not. Harold had to defend the entire southern coast of England, which meant spreading his forces thinly across dozens of miles of beaches and harbours. He could not keep his army mobilized indefinitely. The fyrd troops were farmers and craftsmen who needed to return to their fields and workshops, especially for the vital autumn harvest. Provisions for a large army were expensive and difficult to maintain. By late September, after months of waiting for a Norman invasion that had not materialized, Harold had been forced to make a difficult decision. He had disbanded the southern fyrd and recalled the navy that had been patrolling the channel. The troops returned to their homes for the harvest. The ships were laid up in harbour or dispersed to their home ports. Harold kept a smaller force of professional household troops with him, but could no longer maintain the massive defensive array that had guarded the coast through the summer. Moreover, and this would prove crucial, Harold was not in the south when William landed. He was in the north of England, dealing with a completely different invasion. Harold Hardrada, King of Norway, had launched his own bid for the English throne, landing in Yorkshire with a substantial Norwegian force. Harold had been forced to march his army north to confront this threat, leaving the south temporarily vulnerable. It was either extraordinary luck for William, or perhaps the result of coordination between the Norwegian and Norman invasions. Historians have debated whether William and Hardrada might have timed their invasions to put maximum pressure on Harold. Regardless of whether it was luck or planning, the result was that William landed unopposed and had time to establish a beachhead before Harold could respond. The Normans immediately began securing their position. Even before the entire fleet had landed, William ordered the construction of fortifications. The Normans brought with them prefabricated timber components for a castle, pre-cut logs, beams, and planking that could be quickly assembled into a fortified position. Within hours of landing, Norman carpenters were erecting a motte and bailey castle at Pevensey, the earthen mound being raised, the wooden palisade being set in place, the keep being constructed atop the motte. This was Norman military doctrine at its finest. Secure your position first, establish a fortified base from which operations could be conducted, and to which forces could retreat if necessary. Odo was present for all of this initial activity, helping to organize the army as it came ashore, ensuring provisions were properly unloaded and distributed, using his ecclesiastical authority to maintain order and discipline during the controlled chaos of landing thousands of men on a hostile shore. Medieval armies often included large numbers of non-combatants, servants, craftsmen, cooks, grooms for the horses, washerwomen, and all the other people necessary to keep a military force functioning. Managing such a mixed group, getting them organized on the beach, moving supplies inland, and establishing a functioning camp required considerable administrative ability. The horses had to be unloaded carefully. After hours cramped in the holds of ships, the animals were stiff, nervous, and potentially dangerous. They needed to be walked to restore circulation, given food and water, checked for injuries sustained during the crossing. Armor and weapons had to be inspected to ensure nothing had been damaged by salt water or rough handling. Food supplies had to be inventoried to determine how long they would last before the army needed to find additional provisions, either through foraging, purchase, or seizure from the English countryside. Within days, the Normans had moved from Pevensey to Hastings. where William ordered the construction of another castle to further secure the beachhead. The army was now established on English soil with defensible positions, but the strategic situation remained uncertain. They were invaders in a hostile kingdom, vastly outnumbered by the English population, dependent on maintaining control of their ships for any possibility of retreat if the invasion failed. Their best hope was to force Harold to battle quickly, before the English king could fully mobilize the resources of his kingdom. Word reached Harold in the north that the Normans had landed. The news came just days after Harold had won a tremendous victory at the Battle of Stamford Bridge on September 25th, where he had defeated and killed Harold Hardrada and Harold's own brother Tostig, who had allied with the Norwegians. Stamford Bridge had been a crushing English victory, destroying the Norwegian invasion force almost completely. Harold's troops had fought brilliantly, his tactical decisions had been sound, and he had eliminated one major threat to his throne. But now, while Harold's army was in Yorkshire, celebrating their victory and tending to their wounded, another invasion force had landed 250 miles to the south. Harold faced an agonizing choice: remain in the north to ensure the Norwegian threat was completely eliminated, or march south immediately to confront the Normans. Even though his army was exhausted from the campaign and battle they had just fought, Harold chose immediate action, a decision that would prove both admirable in its courage and potentially disastrous in its consequences. He ordered his army to march south at once, force-marching his troops across England at a pace that must have been grueling. 250 miles in less than 2 weeks, moving as fast as human endurance would allow, pausing only briefly to collect reinforcements from the southern and Midland counties as they passed through. It was an extraordinary physical achievement. Medieval armies typically covered perhaps 10 to 15 miles per day during normal marches, allowing time to set up camp, forage for supplies, and rest. Harold's army was covering nearly 20 miles per day while already exhausted from battle, moving south through the early autumn weather that was beginning to turn cold and wet. Many of Harold's best troops had been left behind in the north, dead at Stamford Bridge, or too wounded to march, or needed to garrison York and other northern cities against any remnants of the Norwegian force. This meant that the army Harold would bring to face William would not be his full strength. It would include his household troops, professional soldiers who fought year-round and were extensively trained and equipped. It would include the southern third that Harold could raise as he marched through southern England. But it would not include many of the northern and Midland troops who had fought so effectively at Stamford Bridge. Still, Harold was confident. He had just destroyed one invasion force. He would destroy another. The English had a strong military tradition, and Harold himself was an experienced and capable commander. News of Harold's rapid approach reached the Norman camp at Hastings within days. William's scouts and spies brought word that the English king was marching south with an army, that he was moving fast, that he intended to attack the Normans before they could establish themselves more firmly in England. This was actually what William wanted: a decisive battle where Norman cavalry could be brought to bear against English infantry, where the question of who would rule England could be settled through combat, rather than a prolonged campaign of sieges and skirmishes that would favour the defenders. William chose his ground carefully. He positioned his forces on a ridge north of Hastings, near the town of Battle, where Harold's army would have to attack uphill if they wanted to drive the Normans back into the sea. It was good defensive terrain, and William intended to use it to his advantage. He organized his forces according to Norman military doctrine: archers in front to harass the enemy at range, infantry behind them to engage in close combat, and cavalry held in reserve to exploit any weaknesses in the enemy formation. And there, in that Norman army preparing for battle was Bishop Odo of Bayeux, about to play his part in one of the most famous battles in English history. The test he had been preparing for throughout his life was at hand. All the years of training in warfare, all the political maneuvering in Norman courts, all the resources he had invested in the invasion, everything came down to what would happen on the ridge near Hastings on October 14, 1066. The night before the battle must have been a time of prayer and preparation, of checking weapons and armor, of contemplating mortality and the possibility of death in a foreign land far from home. Odo, as a bishop, would have offered spiritual support to the troops, led prayers for victory, blessed warriors who knelt before him seeking divine protection. As a warrior himself, he would have prepared his own equipment, ensured his horse was ready, and mentally prepared himself for the test that dawn would bring. The morning of October 14, 1066, dawned misty and cool over the ridge near Hastings, where two armies faced each other across a field that would soon be soaked with blood. As the early morning fog slowly lifted, driven off by the weak autumn sun, the two forces could see each other clearly for the first time, could take measure of their enemies, could contemplate what the next hours would bring. Harold's English army, perhaps 7,000 strong, stood in their defensive formation along the ridge. These were experienced warriors, many of them having just fought and won a brutal battle against the Norwegian invasion in the north. They were tired from their forced march south, but they held the high ground, and their defensive tactics, the famous shield wall that had served English armies for generations, had proven effective countless times before. The English formed a solid line along the ridge, their overlapping shields creating an intimidating barrier of wood and metal, their axes and swords ready to meet anyone who climbed that slope. The shield wall was a formidable defensive formation, perfected through centuries of Anglo-Saxon military tradition. Warriors stood shoulder to shoulder, each man's shield overlapping with his neighbor's to create an almost impenetrable barrier. The front rank held their shields high, protecting their bodies, while those behind them could strike over or between the shields with spears and axes. It was a defensive formation, not designed for rapid movement or offensive action, but extraordinarily effective at holding ground against frontal assault. As long as the warriors maintained discipline, stayed in formation, and held their ground, they were nearly invulnerable to infantry attack. William's army, arrayed at the base of the slope, was organized according to a different tactical philosophy. In the front lines were the archers, whose arrows would begin the assault, softening up the enemy defensive position before the close combat troops engaged. Behind them came the infantry, a mix of professional soldiers and feudal levies, armed with spears, swords, and axes, ready to engage in hand-to-hand combat, and held in reserve, the decisive element that gave William hope for victory. The Norman cavalry, mounted warriors whose charge could break formations that infantry alone could not penetrate. The cavalry represented the cutting edge of Norman military power. These were not simply warriors on horseback, but highly trained knights who had spent years learning to fight from horseback, to control a temperamental war horse in the chaos of battle, to wield lance and sword while mounted, to charge in formation with devastating effect. Each knight represented a substantial investment. The horse alone might cost as much as a small farm, the armor and weapons another fortune, the training years of practice. But when deployed effectively, cavalry could shatter infantry formations, could pursue and destroy fleeing enemies, could dominate a battlefield in ways that foot soldiers could not match. Bishop Odo's role in this battle has been the subject of much historical debate and artistic interpretation, particularly because of how he is depicted in the Bayeux Tapestry. that magnificent embroidered chronicle that may well have been created at his direction years later. In that tapestry, Odo appears multiple times during the battle scenes, always clearly identified by his tonsured head, the circular shaved spot on the crown that marked Catholic clergy, and by Latin inscriptions that name him explicitly and describe his actions. The most famous depiction shows Odo in the thick of the fighting, not standing safely in the rear, but among the Norman troops, wielding not a sword, but a club or staff. The Latin text embroidered above his image reads, Hic Odo epes baculu, tenens comfortat pueros, which translates as, Here Bishop Odo, holding a club, strengthens the boys. This image and its inscription have fascinated historians for nearly 1,000 years, because they seem to capture perfectly the ambiguity and paradox of Odo's position as warrior bishop. Medieval church law was quite clear on one crucial point. Ordained clergy were not supposed to shed blood. This prohibition was taken seriously enough that bishops and priests who found themselves in military situations were theoretically restricted from using edged weapons like swords, axes, or spears that would cause bleeding wounds. The rationale was both theological and practical. Clergy were servants of the Prince of Peace, representatives of Christ who had forbidden Peter to use the sword in his defense. For bishops to personally kill in battle seemed incompatible with their spiritual role as shepherds of souls. However, this did not mean that bishops could not participate in warfare at all, or that they were expected to cower in the rear while others fought. They could pray for victory, certainly, and their prayers were considered valuable, potentially swaying divine favor toward their side. They could offer spiritual support and encouragement, reminding warriors of the righteousness of their cause and the heavenly rewards that awaited those who fought bravely. They could organize logistics, manage supply lines, and handle the administrative aspects of military operations. And they could, as Odo apparently did, physically move among the troops during battle, rallying those who wavered, encouraging those who faltered, using their presence and authority to maintain morale and discipline. The club or staff that Odo wielded in the tapestry might have been chosen specifically to allow him to participate actively in combat while technically observing the prohibition against clergy shedding blood. A club could kill through blunt trauma, crushing skulls, breaking bones, causing internal injuries, without necessarily causing the obvious bleeding that would result from sword or axe wounds. This might seem like a legalistic evasion of the spirit of the prohibition, and perhaps it was, but medieval people often drew such technical distinctions, finding ways to work within religious law while still accomplishing practical objectives. However, historians have debated whether this interpretation is too literal or whether it imposes modern rationality on what might simply have been artistic convention. Many warrior leaders of the period, including Duke William himself, used clubs and maces in battle alongside swords and other weapons. Clubs were effective weapons in their own right, capable of crushing through armor, stunning opponents even when they wore helmets, and being wielded with devastating force. The fact that Odo carried a club might simply indicate that he was equipped for close combat like any other warrior, with the tapestry's artist or Odo himself emphasizing the club rather than other weapons to maintain at least the appearance of respecting his clerical status. What seems indisputable from all accounts, Norman, English, and later historical analysis, is that Odo was not content to remain safely in the rear, offering prayers while others fought and died. He was in the thick of things, moving among the Norman troops, providing encouragement and tactical direction, and perhaps engaging in combat himself despite his clerical status. The tapestry shows him on horseback among the Norman cavalry, his presence unmistakable even in the chaos of battle, his tonsured head identifying him as clearly as any banner or coat of arms. The battle itself began around 9 o'clock in the morning and would continue until dusk, an exhausting length of time for hand-to-hand combat. Medieval battles were not the brief, decisive affairs that modern weapons would later make possible. They were prolonged tests of endurance, courage, and will, where men fought with muscle-powered weapons until sheer physical exhaustion or mounting casualties broke one side's formation and will to continue. The Norman archers opened the attack as the morning sun climbed higher in the October sky, sending volleys of arrows up the slope toward the English shield wall. Hundreds of arrows arced through the air, their iron heads glinting in the sunlight, their feathered flights whistling as they flew. The archers aimed high, seeking to drop their arrows down onto the English position from above, hoping to strike men in the ranks behind the front line who might not have their shields raised. But the English had faced arrow storms before. They knew how to defend themselves. Those in the front ranks raised their shields overhead, creating a protective canopy. Those in the rear ranks who had shields did likewise. The arrows struck with deadly force. Iron arrowheads could punch through leather armor, could wound or kill an unprotected man. But most were stopped by the raised shields, or by the mail armor worn by the better-equipped English warriors. Some arrows found their marks, certainly, striking men who were too slow to raise shields, or finding gaps in the shield wall, or hitting warriors in exposed parts of their bodies. But the shield wall held, and the initial arrow assault, while frightening and painful for those struck, did not significantly weaken the English position. The English stood their ground on that ridge, maintaining their formation, their overlapping shields presenting an unbroken front to the attacking Normans. From behind that wall of shields came shouts of defiance, perhaps songs or war cries meant to maintain English morale and intimidate the attackers. The English warriors beat their weapons against their shields, creating a tremendous din that rolled down the slope toward the Normans, a wall of sound to accompany the wall of shields and steel. Then came the Norman infantry, charging up the slope to engage the shield wall directly. These were the foot soldiers, some armored in mail, others wearing only leather jerkins or padded jackets, all carrying shields, spears, and swords. They advanced up the slope in formation, trying to maintain order as they climbed, their officers and sergeants shouting orders, keeping them together as they moved toward contact with the enemy. The climb itself was exhausting. The slope, while not precipitously steep, was enough to tire men who were already carrying 20 to 40 pounds of armor and weapons. As they climbed, breathing hard, legs burning from the exertion, they had to keep their shields up for protection, maintain formation, and prepare mentally for the collision with the shield wall that was rapidly approaching. When the Norman infantry struck the English shield wall, the sound must have been tremendous. Hundreds of shields slamming together, the crack of wood on wood, the ring of steel on steel, the grunts and shouts of men pushing against each other with all their strength. This was combat at its most primal and exhausting, a shoving match where strength, weight, and determination mattered as much as skill with weapons. The Normans threw themselves against that wall of shields, trying to force gaps in the English line, trying to push through by sheer force, striking with spears and swords at any opening they could find. The English held firm, their dense defensive formation absorbing the attack, their axes and swords striking back at the Normans who pressed too close. English axes, long-handled Danish-style battle axes wielded two-handed, were fearsome weapons that could cleave through shields, could crush helmets, could kill or maim with a single blow. The English warriors wielding these weapons struck from behind their shield wall, their axes rising and falling with deadly efficiency. The Normans took heavy casualties in this first assault. Men fell with smashed skulls, severed limbs, pierced bodies. The slope became slippery with blood, making footing treacherous. Bodies began to pile up at the base of the shield wall, creating obstacles that made the attack even more difficult. The Norman advance stalled, then began to give way. The attacking infantry, exhausted from the climb and the furious combat, unable to break through the English defensive position, began to fall back down the slope in some disorder. The English, seeing the Norman infantry retreat, maintained their position. This was their strength, holding ground, maintaining the shield wall, making the attackers come to them uphill, and then repulsing their assaults. As long as they held their formation, as long as they didn't break ranks to pursue, they were nearly invincible in this defensive position. Harold, commanding from somewhere in the English line, must have felt confident. The first Norman assault had failed. The vaunted Norman warriors had been repulsed. If the English could continue to hold their ground, the Normans might eventually have to withdraw to their ships, having failed to break the English army. What happened next would be debated by historians for nearly 1,000 years, analysed by military scholars studying medieval tactics, and portrayed in the Bayeux Tapestry in scenes whose interpretation remains controversial. The left wing of the Norman army, composed primarily of Breton troops, Bretons being allies of the Normans, but not Normans themselves, began to fall back in what appeared to be disorder, perhaps even panic. Some of the English warriors, seeing this apparent retreat, broke formation. These men, perhaps younger and less experienced, perhaps simply caught up in the excitement of seeming victory, charged down the hill in pursuit of the retreating Bretons. They wanted to turn the retreat into a rout, to cut down the fleeing enemy, to prove their courage and prowess. Breaking the rigid discipline of the shield wall, they rushed down the slope after the Bretons, shouting in triumph. But William's cavalry, which had been waiting in reserve for exactly such an opportunity, wheeled around and fell upon these exposed English troops with devastating effect. The Norman knights, mounted on powerful war horses, crashed into the English warriors who were now scattered and vulnerable, far from the protection of the main shield wall on the ridge. The cavalry charge was overwhelming. Horses weighing 1/2 ton or more, moving at speed, their riders wielding lances and swords, the combined impact capable of smashing through men on foot who had no chance to form a defensive position. The English who had broken formation were cut down, killed in numbers far from the safety of the shield wall that had protected them. It was a disaster for those individuals. But the question that has puzzled historians is, was this Norman retreat genuine, or was it a deliberate tactical ploy, a feigned retreat designed to lure the English out of their strong defensive position? Feigned retreats were a known military tactic, used by skilled cavalry forces to deceive enemies into breaking formation. The idea was simple: pretend to flee in panic, drawing the enemy into pursuit, then turn and counterattack when they were disordered and vulnerable. Nomadic cavalry armies like the Mongols would later make extensive use of this tactic. The Normans, with their Viking heritage, might have known of such tactics or developed them independently. If the initial Breton retreat was feigned, a deliberate tactical maneuver coordinated with the waiting cavalry, then it demonstrates remarkable discipline and sophistication in medieval warfare. It means the Breton troops were willing to simulate panic and flight, risking being cut down if the plan failed, trusting that the cavalry would arrive in time to save them. It means William or his commanders had planned this maneuver and communicated it to different parts of the army that then executed it with precision. But if the retreat was genuine, a real collapse of morale among the Breton troops, who were exhausted and demoralized by the failed assault. Then what followed was opportunistic brilliance by William's cavalry commanders, who saw the English break formation and seized the chance to attack them while they were vulnerable. Either way, the result was the same. Some of the English army had been lured from their position and destroyed, demonstrating that the shield wall was vulnerable if its warriors could be drawn out of formation. The main English force, however, under Harold's command, maintained their discipline and stayed in position on the ridge. Harold was an experienced commander who understood the strength of his position. He refused to allow the seeming success, the apparent flight of part of the Norman army, to tempt him into abandoning the defensive advantage of the high ground and the shield wall formation. His household troops, professional soldiers who had fought in numerous campaigns, knew better than to chase after retreating enemies. They held the line, dressed their ranks where gaps had appeared, and prepared to face the next Norman assault. Throughout this confused fighting, through the failed assault, and the dangerous moment when part of the Norman army seemed to be crumbling, Odo was visible and active. This is where the Bayeux Tapestry shows him most prominently, and where his contribution to the Norman cause may have been most significant. At a critical moment when the Norman assault had stalled, and parts of the army were falling back in disorder, Odo was there among the troops, rallying them, restoring order where the line had wavered, using his position and authority to keep men fighting even when the battle seemed to be going against the invaders. Medieval warfare was as much psychological as physical. An army's will to fight could evaporate in moments if men believed their cause was lost, if they saw their leaders dead or fleeing, if they felt abandoned or betrayed. Once an army began to rout, once the panic of defeat spread through the ranks, it became almost impossible to stop. Men would throw down their weapons and run, concerned only with saving themselves, and a fleeing army could be slaughtered by pursuing enemies who struck down defenseless victims. The Normans, attacking uphill against a strong defensive position, exhausted from their assault, seeing English warriors striking down their comrades, had reason to question whether they could win this battle. If morale broke, if the army decided to flee back to the ships and abandon the invasion, everything would be lost. All the months of preparation, all the resources invested, all the promises made to followers who expected rewards in conquered English lands, all would be for nothing. But Odo would not permit such a collapse. The tapestry shows him mounted on horseback, wielding his club or staff, clearly among the fighting men rather than safely in the rear. He moved through the ranks, his presence unmistakable in his bishop's garments, despite the armor he wore. He called out to warriors by name, reminded them of their duty, appealed to their honor and their greed. For had they not come to England precisely to win lands and wealth through victory in battle? His ecclesiastical authority gave his words special weight. This was not just another noble urging men to fight. This was a bishop, a representative of God's church, blessing their cause and promising divine favor to those who persevered. In an age when religious belief was profound and universal, when men genuinely feared damnation and hoped for salvation, the encouragement of a bishop meant something that purely secular commanders could not provide. There was an even more critical moment that several chroniclers record, a moment when disaster seemed imminent, not just for the army, but for William personally. During the confused fighting, a rumor spread through the Norman ranks that William himself had been killed. This was precisely the kind of crisis that could shatter an army instantly. If the Duke was dead, if their leader had fallen, then the invasion was finished. William's vassals might fight to avenge him, or they might flee to save themselves. But there would be no point in continuing a campaign to win England for a dead man. In medieval warfare, the death of the commanding lord often meant the immediate dissolution of his army. Feudal warriors fought for their lord personally. They had sworn oaths to him. They expected rewards from him. Their loyalty was to him rather than to abstract causes or kingdoms. If he died, those personal bonds dissolved. Each vassal would think first of preserving himself and his men, of getting home to protect his own lands, of surviving to fight another day, rather than dying for a lost cause. If the rumour of William's death had been allowed to spread unchecked, the Norman army might have broken and fled in panic. But William, very much alive and probably furious at the rumour, rode through the army with his helmet pushed back or removed so his face was visible, shouting that he still lived, that they would yet win the day, that no one should lose heart. The sight of the Duke, clearly alive and still commanding, stopped the panic before it could fully develop. And Odo was beside him in these efforts, according to contemporary accounts. He used his voice and his presence to confirm that William lived, to restore confidence among wavering troops, to prevent the cascade of panic that could have destroyed the Norman cause in minutes. Between them, Duke and Bishop, secular leader and spiritual authority, half-brothers bound by blood and mutual interest, William and Odo managed to keep the army together, to restore order and confidence, to prepare for the continued battle that would determine the fate of England. The battle ground on into the afternoon, hour after brutal hour of combat that tested the endurance of both armies to their absolute limits. The Normans tried repeated cavalry charges up the slope, and each time the English shield wall held, though at terrible cost on both sides. The ground between the armies became littered with the dead and wounded, making footing treacherous and charges more difficult. Horses screamed and fell, their riders crushed beneath them or vulnerable to English axes that struck them down. Men fought and bled and died in the mud that their blood had helped create, locked in the fundamental horror of medieval combat, where victory meant literally hacking through the enemy's defenses to reach vulnerable flesh and bone. But slowly, inevitably, despite the courage and skill of the English defenders, their position began to deteriorate. They were taking casualties they could not replace. Every warrior who fell left a gap in the shield wall that had to be filled by those behind, gradually thinning their ranks. The Normans, with their larger force and the ability to rotate fresh troops into the line, could sustain casualties that the English could not. Moreover, the English had marched 250 miles in less than 2 weeks before fighting this battle. They were already exhausted when the battle began, and as the hours passed, that exhaustion became an ever greater factor. The Normans began trying new tactics, learning from their failed frontal assaults. They attempted combined arms assaults, using different types of troops in coordinated attacks designed to overwhelm the English defences through sheer variety and complexity. Archers shot high into the air, raining arrows down on the English, who had to raise their shields overhead to protect themselves. While the shields were raised, blocking downward vision and restricting movement, Norman cavalry charged, breaking through gaps in the now disrupted shield wall. Infantry followed immediately behind the cavalry, pouring into the breaches before the English could reform their defensive line. This combination of archery, cavalry charges, and infantry assault began to tell against the English position. Gaps in the shield wall that previously could be quickly closed now remained open longer, allowing Norman troops to penetrate the English line. Hand-to-hand fighting broke out in multiple places along the ridge. Brutal close-quarters combat where shields were used as weapons, where men stabbed with daggers when they lost their swords, where desperation drove warriors to extraordinary feats of strength and violence. The sun moved across the sky toward the west, afternoon shadows lengthening across the battlefield. Both armies were exhausted now, both having fought for hours without significant rest, both having taken enormous casualties. But the English were being worn down, their numbers decreasing, their defensive perimeter shrinking, their ability to respond to new threats diminishing with every passing hour. Then, late in the afternoon, as the day drew toward its close, disaster struck the English cause. King Harold, who had commanded brilliantly throughout the day, despite the exhaustion of his forced march and his previous battle in the north, was struck down. The exact circumstances of his death remain uncertain, the subject of conflicting accounts and artistic interpretation that has fueled debate for centuries. The traditional story, the one that most people know, is that Harold was struck in the eye by an arrow. The Bayeux Tapestry seems to show this, depicting a figure labeled Harold pulling an arrow from his face. This image has become iconic, one of the most famous scenes from the tapestry and one of the most well-known details of medieval history. An arrow to the eye would be a hideously painful way to die, and the image captures something of the random cruelty of warfare, where a king could be killed by a nameless archer's shot as easily as the humblest foot soldier. But the interpretation of the tapestry scene is more complex than it first appears. The embroidery is damaged in this section, making it difficult to determine exactly what it originally showed. Some historians believe the figure pulling at an arrow is Harold, while others think Harold is actually the next figure in the sequence, being cut down by Norman cavalry. Perhaps both images represent Harold, first wounded by the arrow, then killed by knights who finished off the wounded king. The truth may never be known with certainty, lost in the chaos of battle and the imperfect record of sources created by victors who had reason to shape the story to their advantage. What matters historically is not precisely how Harold died, but the fact that he died at all, and the catastrophic effect his death had on English resistance. The king's death in battle was the ultimate disaster for a medieval army. With Harold dead, the English had no clear leader, no one whose authority all would recognize, no rallying point around which to organize continued resistance. The earls and thegns who led various contingents of the English army now had to make individual decisions about whether to continue fighting or to flee. Some fought to the death, forming desperate last stands around Harold's fallen body, or in small groups across the battlefield, determined to die rather than flee or surrender. These were men bound by personal loyalty to Harold, or members of his household who had sworn oaths to protect him even unto death, or simply warriors whose sense of honor would not permit flight while enemies remained on English soil. They fought with the courage of desperation, knowing they were doomed but determined to exact as high a price as possible from the Norman victory. But the main English army, seeing their king dead and their position hopeless, began to dissolve. The shield wall, which had held so stubbornly for hours despite everything the Normans could throw at it, finally broke. Warriors who had stood shoulder to shoulder throughout the long day suddenly thought of themselves as individuals rather than as parts of a unified force. The instinct for self-preservation, suppressed through hours of disciplined fighting, suddenly reasserted itself. Men threw down their shields, heavy burdens for running, and fled toward the gathering darkness, hoping to escape into the forests and marshes that lay beyond the battlefield, hoping to survive this disaster and perhaps fight another day. The Norman cavalry, given the opportunity they had sought throughout the entire battle, pursued the fleeing English with savage efficiency. This was what cavalry did best, running down fleeing infantry, cutting down men who could not defend themselves as they ran. The pursuit continued into the darkening evening. Norman knights chasing and killing English warriors who had thrown down their weapons, slaughtering men who tried to surrender, giving no quarter to the defeated army. The Battle of Hastings was over, and William had won. At tremendous cost, perhaps a quarter of his army killed or wounded, some of his best knights dead on the ridge. He had destroyed the English military and killed their king. England lay open before him, ready for conquest. The gamble he had taken, the enormous risk of the invasion, the months of preparation and the agonizing wait for favorable winds, all had been justified by this single day's combat. And Odo, who had played such a visible role in the battle, who had helped rally the troops when disaster threatened, who had been there in the thick of the fighting, wielding his club and shouting encouragement, would soon reap the rewards of his loyalty and courage. The half-brother of a duke would become the half-brother of a king, and his position and power would expand beyond anything he had known in Normandy. But in the immediate aftermath of the battle, there was no time for celebration. William ordered the battlefield cleared, a grim and necessary task that would take days. The dead had to be buried or burned. Leaving thousands of corpses to rot would breed disease, offend Christian sensibilities, and create a morbid spectacle. The English dead were buried in mass graves or burned in enormous pyres that sent smoke billowing into the October sky. The Norman dead received more individual attention. Those of sufficient rank might have their bodies sent back to Normandy for burial in family crypts, while others were interred with Christian rites on English soil where they had fallen. The wounded had to be tended to, though medieval medicine offered little beyond basic wound cleaning, bandaging, and prayer. Men with minor wounds, cuts and bruises that would heal on their own, could expect to recover. Those with broken bones might survive if the breaks could be set properly, though many would be permanently crippled. But warriors with serious wounds, deep cuts that had damaged internal organs, crushed limbs that would turn gangrenous, head injuries that seemed minor but would prove fatal in days, had little chance of survival. The medieval battlefield produced death not just during combat, but for days and weeks afterward, as wounded men succumbed to infections, blood loss, and injuries that medieval surgeons could not treat. Odo would have been involved in organizing these post-battle activities, using his administrative skills to manage the logistics of dealing with thousands of casualties. As a bishop, he would also have performed religious services, blessing the dead, offering prayers for the souls of those killed, and providing what spiritual comfort was possible to the wounded and dying. Medieval people believed deeply in the afterlife, in heaven and hell, in the fate of the soul after the body's death. For dying warriors, the assurance of a bishop's blessing might be the last comfort they received before passing from this world to the next. But William could not afford to rest on his victory. The Battle of Hastings had destroyed one English army and killed one English king, but it had not conquered England. Throughout the kingdom, English nobles who had not been at Hastings, earls in the north and west, thanes throughout the countryside, potential rival claimants to the throne, might yet organize resistance. The English navy still existed, potentially able to cut off Norman supply lines across the Channel. English cities, strongly fortified, might resist Norman occupation. The longer William gave the surviving English leaders to organize, the more difficult the conquest would become. William faced another concern. His army, though victorious, was depleted and exhausted. The casualties at Hastings meant he had far fewer troops than when he landed. Disease and desertions would further reduce his strength. He needed to demonstrate that resistance was futile before his army became too weak to enforce his will. He needed to overawe the English with displays of military power while he still had that power to display. William's strategy in the days and weeks following Hastings was calculated to inspire terror and submission in equal measure. He did not march directly on London, the largest city in England, where the remaining English leaders might gather to organize resistance. Instead, he circled around the city, devastating the countryside in a deliberate campaign of destruction designed to demonstrate that he could strike wherever he wished and that resistance would bring only ruin. Norman troops burned villages, seized food stores, drove off livestock, and generally made it clear that cooperation with the new regime would be rewarded, while resistance would be punished mercilessly. This was not mindless violence, but calculated policy, the medieval equivalent of shock and awe tactics. William wanted English nobles to understand that they faced a choice: submit and keep their lands and lives, or resist and lose everything. The psychological impact of this campaign was profound. English thanes who might have considered organizing resistance saw the smoke rising from burning villages and reconsidered. Local populations, terrified of Norman retribution, brought provisions to Norman camps rather than hiding them. English nobles began appearing at William's temporary headquarters, offering their submission, swearing oaths of loyalty to the Norman Duke who claimed to be England's rightful king. The English Church, led by Archbishop Steigen of Canterbury, faced a particularly difficult position. Steigen's own appointment had been controversial. He had been installed by Harold's father, Earl Godwin, years earlier in circumstances that many considered irregular, and his position had never been fully recognized by Rome. Now, with Harold dead and William claiming the throne, Steigen had to choose between maintaining loyalty to a defeated English cause or accommodating the Norman conquerors who would control England's future. In the end, pragmatism prevailed. The English clergy, after some negotiation and soul-searching, agreed to recognize William as king. This was a crucial legitimizing step. If the Church acknowledged William's kingship, it suggested divine approval of the Norman conquest, making resistance not just politically futile, but potentially sinful. The Church's endorsement helped transform William from foreign invader to legitimate monarch in the eyes of many English people who might otherwise have continued to resist. Odo played an important role in these negotiations with the English Church. As Bishop of Bayeux and William's half-brother, he could speak with both spiritual and political authority. He could discuss theological and canonical issues with English bishops, while also making clear the political realities they faced. His involvement helped smooth the Church's transition from supporting the English monarchy to accepting Norman rule. English nobles continued to submit throughout November and into December. Some came voluntarily, calculating that early submission would earn them better treatment from the conquerors. Others came reluctantly, under pressure from their neighbors who had already submitted or faced with the impossible task of organizing military resistance when the main English army had been destroyed and the king was dead. Edgar Atheling, a teenage boy with some claim to the English throne through his descent from earlier English kings, was brought forward by his supporters as a potential rival to William. But Edgar was young, inexperienced, and lacked the military power to challenge Norman control. Eventually, even Edgar's supporters recognized the futility of resistance and brought the boy to William to make his submission. By late December, William felt secure enough to proceed with a formal coronation. On Christmas Day, 1066, just over 2 months after the Battle of Hastings, 3 months after landing at Pevensey, William was crowned King of England at Westminster Abbey. The ceremony was a deliberate blend of Norman and English traditions, an attempt to legitimize the conquest by cloaking it in the forms of established English kingship. The coronation service followed the traditional English rite, with prayers and rituals that English kings had used for generations. William took oaths to protect the church, uphold justice, and govern according to law, the same oaths English kings had sworn. He was anointed with holy oil, a sacramental act that transformed him from mere warrior duke to divinely appointed monarch. The crown was placed on his head by English bishops, suggesting ecclesiastical approval and continuity with the legitimate English royal line. But if anyone doubted that this was fundamentally a conquest rather than a consensual succession, the military realities were impossible to ignore. Norman soldiers surrounded Westminster Abbey during the ceremony, armed and watchful for any sign of resistance. When shouts arose during the coronation, perhaps cheers from inside the abbey, perhaps alarm at some disturbance outside, nervous Norman guards apparently thought rebellion had broken out and began setting fire to nearby buildings. The ceremony continued despite the chaos, with smoke visible through the abbey windows, a grim reminder that Norman rule rested ultimately on force rather than consent. But William was now king, crowned and anointed, with at least the formal acquiescence of the English church and nobility. The conquest was far from complete. Years of rebellions and pacification campaigns lay ahead, but the crucial step of establishing William as legitimate monarch, rather than mere foreign occupier, had been accomplished. England had a new king, and that king's supporters would be rewarded for their loyalty and courage during the invasion. And among those supporters, few had contributed more or would be rewarded more handsomely than Bishop Odo of Bayeux. In the year 1067, roughly 6 months after the coronation, King William I made a decision that would fundamentally shape the governance of conquered England for the next 15 years. He granted his half-brother Odo the Earldom of Kent, making him simultaneously one of the most powerful religious figures in Normandy and one of the most powerful secular magnates in England. It was an extraordinary grant of power that reflected both William's trust in his half-brother and the strategic importance of the territory being bestowed. Kent was no ordinary earldom. It was the southeastern corner of England, the region closest to Normandy across the English Channel, the gateway between the continent and the island. Dover, with its crucial castle guarding the narrowest point of the channel, just 21 miles from the French coast, lay within Kent. Control of Kent meant control over communications and transportation between Normandy and England, over the flow of supplies and reinforcements that William would need to maintain his conquest, over the ability to retreat to Normandy if the conquest failed. From this strategic position alone, Kent was invaluable. But William's grant to Odo went far beyond just Kent itself. As the new king distributed English lands to his Norman followers, rewarding those who had fought at Hastings, binding his supporters to the conquest's success by giving them stakes in maintaining Norman control, Odo received one of the largest shares. The chroniclers record that William gave Odo estates and properties across England, spreading from Kent through the southeast and into East Anglia, touching 23 different counties. These were not small holdings, a manor here, a farm there. These were entire estates with multiple villages, hundreds or thousands of acres of farmland, forests rich in timber and game, watermills that ground grain and brought in steady revenue, churches whose tithes enriched the earl, markets whose fees added to his income. By the time the distributions were complete and recorded in the Domesday Book nearly 20 years later, Odo's English holdings generated an annual income conservatively estimated at over £3,000, an almost unimaginable fortune by the standards of the age. To put this wealth in perspective, £3,000 per year in 1067 was more than many entire counties produced in total revenue. It was more income than most Norman dukes could hope to collect from their entire domains. It represented the productive capacity of thousands of farms worked by tens of thousands of peasants, the output of scores of villages and towns, the economic activity of a substantial portion of England's total population. Odo had become literally overnight one of the wealthiest men in Western Europe. Only the king himself possessed greater resources in England. With this wealth came political power and responsibility that far exceeded anything Odo had known in Normandy. As Earl of Kent and one of the kingdom's greatest landholders, Odo was expected to maintain military forces adequate to his position, to garrison castles and keep order in his territories, to administer justice in his lands, to collect taxes and fees for the crown, and to appear at the royal court when summoned to give counsel and perform his feudal obligations. But beyond these standard responsibilities of a great earl, William gave Odo something even more significant: authority to act as the king's representative in governing England itself. William could not be in two places at once. He was still Duke of Normandy, with responsibilities in his continental domains that required his personal attention. Normandy faced threats from neighbouring French territories, from nobles who might challenge ducal authority if the Duke seemed preoccupied with his new English kingdom, from the French king himself, who theoretically held overlordship over Normandy and might exploit William's absence. This meant William needed to travel back and forth across the Channel regularly, spending months at a time in Normandy. While his English kingdom required governance, he needed reliable lieutenants in England who could act with his full authority during his absences, who could command the Norman garrisons, collect taxes, administer justice, suppress rebellions, and make the countless daily decisions that governance required. Odo was the most important of these lieutenant governors, these regents who ruled England in the king's name. When William returned to Normandy in March of 1067, leaving England for the first time since the conquest, he appointed two men to govern in his absence, Odo and William Fitzosborne. Fitzosborne was another of William's most trusted nobles, a capable administrator and military commander who received the earldom of Hereford and responsibility for the Welsh frontier. But Odo's position was arguably more important, given Kent's strategic location and his broader responsibilities throughout southern and eastern England. These two men would be responsible for everything: maintaining the Norman military occupation of a hostile kingdom, keeping the newly built castles properly garrisoned, ensuring that Norman knights who had received English estates could actually take possession of them against potential English resistance, collecting the revenues that William needed to finance his rule, and dealing with whatever problems arose: rebellions, banditry, disputes between Norman settlers and English landholders, ecclesiastical controversies, legal questions about property and inheritance. It was an enormous grant of authority, essentially making Odo the second most powerful man in England whenever the king was absent. And William was absent frequently. The chronicles suggest he spent roughly half his time in Normandy during the years after the conquest, sometimes for months at a stretch. This meant that Odo exercised near royal authority for extended periods, making decisions that affected the lives of hundreds of thousands of people, commanding military forces, dispensing justice, and accumulating additional power and wealth beyond even what his formal grants had given him. Contemporary accounts suggest that Odo threw himself into this role with characteristic energy and ruthlessness. He moved through his domains frequently, never staying in one place long enough for complacency or corruption to take root among his subordinate officials. He inspected castles to ensure they were properly maintained and garrisoned, understanding that Norman control of England depended on these fortifications that allowed small numbers of Norman soldiers to dominate much larger English populations. He held courts where justice was administered according to the evolving synthesis of Norman and English law that would become the basis for England's future legal system. These courts dealt with everything from disputes over land and property to criminal cases involving theft, assault, and murder. The Earl's justice was the highest authority in his territories when the king was absent, and Odo's decisions shaped how Norman law would be applied in conquered England. He ensured that revenues were properly collected. The taxes, fees, and rents that supported the Norman occupation and enriched both the royal treasury and his own coffers. Medieval taxation was complex, involving not just money payments, but services, goods in kind, and various customary obligations that varied from place to place. Managing this system required capable administrators, careful record keeping, and the will to enforce collection against those who might try to evade their obligations. And he made his presence felt throughout his extensive holdings, ensuring that Norman authority was visible and respected. Medieval governance was intensely personal. Peasants and minor nobles needed to see their lord occasionally, needed to know he was real and powerful, needed to fear his punishment and hope for his favor. Odo understood this, and his frequent travels through his domains served to remind everyone of who held power in Norman England. But to the English who lived through this period, Odo represented something very different from an effective administrator. To the defeated English, Odo embodied everything oppressive and exploitative about the Norman conquest. He was foreign, French in speech and culture, Norman in allegiance, with no particular sympathy for English customs or concerns. He was harsh, willing to use violence and intimidation to enforce Norman rule, showing little mercy to those who resisted or even those who were slow to cooperate. And he enriched himself at English expense, acquiring lands and properties that had belonged to English nobles for generations, claiming revenues that English kings had traditionally collected. The English chroniclers who wrote about this period, writing in secret since open criticism of the conquerors could be dangerous, painted Odo in the darkest possible colors. He appears in their accounts as a predator, a ravening wolf who devoured English wealth and property without conscience or restraint. One particularly hostile chronicler, writing years later but presumably drawing on contemporary English sentiment, called Odo specifically a ravening wolf, a beast who could not be satisfied no matter how much he took. These English complaints were not entirely without foundation. The Norman conquest involved a massive transfer of wealth and property from English hands to Norman ones. Thousands of English landholders, from great earls who had controlled vast territories to minor thegns with a few hides of land, lost their estates to Norman newcomers. English monasteries and churches, which had accumulated considerable wealth over centuries, found themselves under pressure to yield properties to Norman nobles and bishops. The economic disruption was enormous, creating resentment that would fuel English resistance for years to come. Odo was certainly aggressive in acquiring lands and properties, and not all of these acquisitions were necessarily authorized by the king or acquired through what even Normans would consider proper legal channels. There are indications throughout the documentary record of the period that Odo was using his position to seize properties that had belonged to English monasteries and churches, claiming them for himself on various pretexts that might not have held up under careful legal scrutiny. This was particularly serious because church properties were supposed to enjoy special protection. While it was one thing to confiscate the lands of English nobles who had fought against William at Hastings, that was the normal practice of conquest, where the defeated lost their holdings to the victors. It was quite another matter to seize the endowments of religious institutions. Such properties had been granted to the church for the salvation of souls, blessed by bishops, protected by sacred oaths and divine sanction. For a bishop to be seizing church lands was especially scandalous, a betrayal of his spiritual office for worldly gain. But during these early years of Norman rule, when everything was still fluid and uncertain, when power structures were being established and property rights were being redefined to fit Norman legal concepts onto English realities, Odo seemed to operate with impunity. He had the king's favour. He commanded military force sufficient to enforce his will, and he possessed the wealth to reward followers and maintain a substantial household of knights and retainers who owed everything to him. Complaints against him, if they reached William at all, apparently carried less weight than Odo's value as a loyal administrator and military commander. The challenges Odo faced in governing Norman England were substantial and multifaceted. This was not a peaceful kingdom accepting a new dynasty, but a conquered territory where the vast majority of the population resented their conquerors and where periodic rebellions erupted that had to be suppressed through military force. The English might have submitted after Hastings, might have sworn oaths of loyalty to William, but they had not internalized acceptance of Norman rule. They waited, hoped, and occasionally rose in rebellion when they thought they saw opportunity. Norman control rested on a combination of military force, administrative capability, and the gradual accommodation between conquerors and conquered that would develop over generations. The military force came from castles, those distinctive Norman fortifications that began appearing across England immediately after the conquest. These were not the stone castles of later centuries, but motte and bailey castles that could be constructed quickly using local labour and materials. The motte was an artificial hill created by piling up earth, often in a circular mound that could be 50 or more feet high. Atop this motte stood the keep, a wooden tower that served as the castle's final defensive position and as the lord's residence. The bailey was an enclosed courtyard at the base of the motte, surrounded by a wooden palisade and ditch containing workshops, stables, barracks for soldiers, and other necessary buildings. These castles could be built in weeks rather than years, allowing the Normans to quickly establish defensive positions throughout England. A relatively small garrison, perhaps 20 or 30 soldiers, stationed in a castle, could dominate the surrounding countryside, respond to threats, and serve as a base for collecting taxes and administering justice. The castle's height gave defenders a tremendous advantage over attackers, and the wooden palisades, though not as strong as later stone walls, were sufficient to stop attacks by English forces who lacked siege equipment. Odo was responsible for ensuring that castles were built and maintained throughout his territories, that they were properly garrisoned with reliable soldiers, that they had sufficient supplies to withstand siege if necessary. He had to balance the need for security, which required spreading forces thinly across many castle garrisons, against the need for mobile field forces that could respond to rebellions or raids. It was a constant challenge that required careful calculation of risk and resource allocation. Beyond military considerations, Odo faced the challenge of administering justice in a society where two different legal systems, Norman and English, were colliding and needed to be synthesized into something workable. Norman law was based on feudal concepts brought from the continent, emphasizing the lord-vassal relationship, the importance of sworn oaths, and the use of trial by combat to settle disputes. English law had its own ancient traditions, dating back centuries before the conquest, with complex systems of vergild, monetary compensation for injuries, communal responsibility for maintaining order, and extensive customary rights. Odo and the other Norman administrators had to create a working legal system that incorporated elements of both traditions while ultimately serving Norman interests. They had to decide when to apply Norman law and when to respect English customs. They had to determine how property disputes between Normans and the English would be settled when the two groups had fundamentally different concepts of land ownership and inheritance. They had to establish courts with jurisdiction over different types of cases and different classes of people. The administrative challenge was complicated by language barriers. Norman French and English were mutually unintelligible languages. Official proceedings required translators. Documents had to be created in Latin, the universal language of medieval administration and church affairs. But even Latin documents had to be explained to both Norman and English parties who might not understand the language. Misunderstandings were common, and deliberate obfuscation was easy when contracts and court proceedings required translation between languages that had different legal vocabularies and conceptual frameworks. One of the most sensitive and problematic areas where Odo's interests conflicted with both English sentiment and church law involved the disposition of lands that had belonged to English monasteries and churches before the conquest. These properties represented enormous wealth. Perhaps a third of England's arable land was held by ecclesiastical institutions in 1066, and Norman nobles eyed them covetously. But simply seizing church lands wholesale would create serious problems with the church hierarchy and with Rome, risking excommunication and religious conflict that would undermine the conquest's legitimacy. The Normans developed various strategies for acquiring church lands while maintaining at least a veneer of legality. Some lands were claimed to have been held illegally by English churches, seized from laymen during the disorders of previous reigns, and therefore subject to reclamation. Other properties were said to be held by the church in name only, actually controlled by English nobles who had used monasteries as convenient repositories for wealth they wanted to protect from royal taxation or seizure. Still, other lands were exchanged, taken from English churches and given to Norman churches or bishops, with a theoretical justification that this was reorganization rather than confiscation. Odo appears to have been particularly aggressive in using these and other mechanisms to acquire church properties for himself. As both a bishop and a powerful earl, he could claim expertise in ecclesiastical affairs and authority to make decisions about church property. He could argue that he was better positioned than English churchmen to manage properties effectively in the new Norman order. He could suggest that properties needed to be consolidated, reorganized, or transferred to ensure proper administration. But underneath these legal and administrative justifications lay a simple reality. Odo was using his power to enrich himself at the expense of English churches whose properties he claimed. Monasteries that had held lands for centuries found themselves dispossessed. Churches that depended on rents and tithes from specific estates discovered that those estates now belonged to the Earl of Kent. English bishops and abbots who protested found themselves facing a bishop-earl with the full backing of the king and the military force to enforce his claims. This systematic appropriation of church property was creating resentment not just among the English, but among some Norman churchmen as well. The new Archbishop of Canterbury, Lanfranc, who had been appointed to replace the discredited Stigand, was a very different sort of churchman than Odo. Lanfranc was a scholar, a theologian, a man genuinely committed to church reform and spiritual improvement rather than worldly enrichment. He had been a renowned teacher at the monastery of Bec in Normandy, had served as abbot of William's Foundation at Caen, and brought to Canterbury a reputation for learning, piety, and administrative competence. When Lanfranc examined the state of Canterbury's holdings after taking office in 1070, he was appalled by what he discovered. Extensive properties that had belonged to Canterbury for generations, lands granted by English kings, by pious nobles, by previous archbishops who had accumulated the church's wealth over centuries, were now in the possession of Norman nobles, and a substantial portion of these lost properties were held by none other than Odo, Bishop of Bayeux and Earl of Kent. Lanfranc was not a man to accept such losses quietly, even when the Earl of Kent was the king's brother and one of the most powerful men in England. As Archbishop of Canterbury, Lanfranc held the highest ecclesiastical position in England, with authority that theoretically superseded even that of a bishop earl. He also had King William's respect. William valued Lanfranc's learning and administrative ability, saw him as crucial to maintaining church support for Norman rule, and was willing to listen to his concerns even when they involved powerful Norman nobles. Throughout the early 1070s, as Odo continued to accumulate wealth and exercise near royal authority during William's absences, complaints began to accumulate. English landholders dispossessed by Norman grants protested that they had been unjustly deprived of their properties. English churchmen complained that monasteries were being stripped of their endowments. Even some Norman nobles grumbled that Odo was exceeding his authority, making decisions that should have been reserved for the king, using his position as regent to enrich himself beyond what was proper, even by the generous standards of Norman conquest. Most seriously, Archbishop Lanfranc was compiling evidence of Odo's seizures of church property, preparing a case that would demonstrate systematic abuse of power and illegal appropriation of lands that belonged to Canterbury and other English ecclesiastical institutions. Lanfranc was meticulous, gathering documents that proved Canterbury's historical ownership of specific estates, interviewing English witnesses who could testify about how properties had been held before the conquest, and building an irrefutable case that Odo had taken what was not his to claim. William, returning from one of his stays in Normandy in the early 1070s, found his court filled with complaints about his half-brother's behavior. While William needed Odo's administrative capability and military leadership, while he valued family loyalty and was reluctant to move against his own brother, he also needed to maintain the support of the English Church and had to be seen as a just ruler who enforced law rather than merely the will of the strongest. If William simply ignored complaints against Odo, if he allowed his brother to plunder church property with impunity, it would undermine the legitimacy of Norman rule and potentially create a crisis with the church hierarchy. The situation came to a head in 1073, when Odo faced his first major test as regent and military commander in William's absence. A significant rebellion broke out in England, not a spontaneous uprising, but a coordinated conspiracy that threatened to reverse the Norman conquest if successful. This was the Revolt of the Earls, a rebellion that would test both Odo's military competence and his loyalty to his half-brother's interests. In the spring of 1073, while King William was occupied with affairs in Normandy, dealing with threats from the King of France and managing disputes among his Norman vassals, troubling reports began reaching Odo in England. There were whispers of conspiracy, rumours of secret meetings between powerful English nobles, suggestions that a coordinated rebellion was being planned that would seek to overthrow Norman rule entirely. The conspiracy, when it finally emerged into the open, proved to be substantial and dangerous. At its centre stood Earl Waltheof, one of the few English nobles who had retained significant power after the conquest. Waltheof was the son of the legendary Earl Siward of Northumbria, a warrior of such renown that Norse sagas would celebrate his deeds for generations. Waltheof had initially submitted to William after Hastings, had sworn oaths of loyalty, and had even been permitted to retain his earldom and marry William's niece. But submission had apparently festered into resentment, and now Waltheof was plotting rebellion. Joining him was Ralph de Gale, the Earl of Norfolk, who despite his Breton origins had joined forces with English resistors. Ralph brought military experience and the forces from his earldom in East Anglia. The conspirators also had the support, or at least the sympathy, of other nobles scattered throughout England, men who resented Norman domination and saw in this rebellion a chance to restore English independence. The rebels' plan was ambitious and sophisticated. They would coordinate uprisings across England, creating multiple threats that would force the Normans to divide their forces. Simultaneously, they would seek military support from Denmark, whose King Svein had his own claims to the English throne through his descent from earlier Danish kings who had ruled England. If Danish ships could bring a fresh invasion force to England's eastern coast, while Norman attention was divided by rebellions throughout the kingdom, the conquest might yet be reversed. But conspiracies are difficult to maintain in secret, especially when they involve numerous participants spread across a kingdom. Someone talked, perhaps inadvertently, perhaps deliberately betraying the plot in hopes of reward from the Norman authorities. Word of the rebellion reached Odo's ears before the rebels could fully mobilize their forces, giving him the crucial advantage of time to prepare a response. Odo acted with the decisiveness that the situation demanded. He raised troops from his own estates and from other Norman loyalists throughout the kingdom. He sent urgent messages to castles throughout England, ordering garrisons to be alert for signs of rebellion, to strengthen their defences, and to prepare to move against rebel strongholds when ordered. He dispatched messengers across the Channel to inform William of the crisis, though Odo knew that by the time the king could return with reinforcements, the initial confrontation would already have been decided. The rebellion never achieved the coordination its planners had hoped for. With their conspiracy exposed before they were fully prepared, the rebels found themselves fighting piecemeal rather than in a coordinated campaign. Odo moved against them systematically, using his superior organization and the network of Norman castles to defeat rebel forces in detail before they could combine into a unified army. Ralph de Gale found his position in Norfolk untenable as Norman forces converged on his territory. Rather than face certain defeat and probable execution, he fled to Brittany before Odo's forces could trap him. He would live out the rest of his life in continental exile, his English estates confiscated, his rebellion a failure. Some of his followers were captured, tried and punished according to Norman law, which meant harsh penalties including mutilation and blinding for some of the leaders, imprisonment or fines for others, and confiscation of property for virtually all who had participated. Earl Waltheof was not so fortunate as to escape. He was captured by Norman forces and brought before Odo for judgment. As regent in the king's absence, Odo had the authority to dispense justice in William's name, including passing sentence on captured rebels. But the fate of an English earl, one of the last remaining English nobles of high rank, and one who had married into William's own family through his niece, was significant enough that Odo chose to wait for William's return before determining Waltheof's punishment. Waltheof remained in custody throughout late 1073 and into 1074 and 1075. As the full extent of the rebellion was investigated, and as William considered what to do with his captured brother-in-law, the king faced a difficult choice. Mercy might encourage other English nobles to believe they could plot against Norman rule without facing ultimate consequences. But executing Waltheof would send a different message, that rebellion against Norman authority would result in death, that even family connections would not protect traitors, that William's patience with English resistance had limits. When William returned to England in 1076, Waltheof's trial was held. The evidence against him was substantial. His participation in the conspiracy was undeniable. His violation of his oaths to William was clear, and his intention to overthrow Norman rule and potentially invite Danish invasion constituted treason of the gravest sort. The verdict was death, and Waltheof was beheaded at Winchester in May of 1076, becoming the only English earl to be executed by the Norman conquerors. The execution sent shockwaves through English society. For 5 years after Hastings, despite all the harshness of the conquest, despite the dispossession of English landholders and the destruction of the English nobility as a class, William had not executed any of the great English earls. There had been punishments, imprisonment, exile, confiscation of lands, but not judicial execution of nobles. Waltheof's death marked a line crossed, a demonstration that William's relative restraint had limits and that continued resistance would be met with the ultimate sanction. Odo's handling of the revolt of the earls was generally regarded as successful by Norman standards. He had moved quickly, prevented the conspiracy from achieving its objectives, maintained order until William could return, and demonstrated that rebellion against Norman rule would be crushed. His effectiveness as a military commander and administrator seemed proven, but his very success, his accumulation of power and wealth, and the methods he had used to enrich himself were beginning to generate serious concerns among those who had to account for the state of England's governance. Archbishop Lanfranc, who had been compiling evidence of Odo's seizures of church property, now had both the documentation and the political support necessary to formally challenge the bishop-earl's acquisitions. Lanfranc petitioned King William for a formal inquiry into Odo's appropriation of lands that belonged to the Church of Canterbury and the Diocese of Rochester. This was a serious accusation, backed by one of the most respected churchmen in Europe, and William could not simply dismiss it without undermining his own claims to rule England justly and according to law. William agreed to the inquiry and ordered that a great trial be held to determine the truth of Lanfranc's accusations. The trial would be conducted at Penenden Heath in Kent, in the very heart of Odo's own earldom, and would involve not just the two principals, but a large assembly of the most important secular and religious figures in Norman England. This would be no small proceeding held in secret, but a major public event where questions of law, property rights, and the proper limits of even the most powerful magnate's authority would be determined. The trial at Penenden Heath, which took place over 3 days in the summer of 1076, would become one of the most significant legal proceedings of the entire Norman period. It was important not just for its immediate outcome, the disposition of specific properties between Odo and Canterbury, but for what it demonstrated about the nature of Norman rule in England and the principle that even the king's own brother could be held accountable under law. King William ordered that the trial be presided over by Geoffrey de Montbray, the Bishop of Coutances, who would represent the Crown's interests and ensure fair proceedings. Archbishop Lanfranc would present the case for the Church, marshalling his evidence of Canterbury's historical ownership of disputed properties. Odo would defend himself against the charges, presenting whatever justifications he had for his acquisitions of these lands. But there was a fundamental problem that had to be addressed before the substantive issues could even be considered. Much of the dispute turned on the question of what lands had belonged to Canterbury before the conquest, which required detailed knowledge of English law and custom, as it had existed under the Anglo-Saxon kings. The Normans were still relatively new to England. Barely a decade had passed since the conquest, and they were not intimately familiar with the complex web of land tenure, customary rights, and ecclesiastical endowments that had developed over centuries of English history. To resolve this difficulty, William issued an extraordinary order that demonstrated his commitment to at least the appearance of legal fairness. He commanded that Ethelric, the former Bishop of Selsey, be brought to the trial to testify about English law and custom. Ethelric was described in the trial records as a very old man, very learned in the laws of the land. He had been bishop before the conquest, had lived through decades of English history under multiple kings, and possessed the kind of deep institutional memory that was invaluable for determining how property matters had been arranged in pre-conquest England. The chronicles record that Ethelric was so old and frail that he had to be carried to Penenden Heath in a chariot or cart, unable to make the journey on horseback like younger men. But once there, despite his age and physical weakness, he proved to be a formidable witness whose testimony would be crucial in determining which properties had legitimately belonged to Canterbury and which Odo had no legal right to claim. The trial itself must have been an impressive and unusual spectacle. The great open space of Penenden Heath, filled with the most powerful men in Norman England, bishops in their ecclesiastical robes, earls and barons in their finest garments, knights and officials who had travelled from across the kingdom to witness this confrontation between Archbishop and Bishop Earl. Geoffrey de Montbray presided from a position of prominence, symbolising royal authority and the king's commitment to justice. On one side stood Lanfranc with his supporters and witnesses, ready to present Canterbury's case. On the other side stood Odo, equally prepared to defend his actions and his claim to the disputed properties. The assembly included numerous other important figures beyond the three principals. Arnost, Bishop of Rochester, whose diocese's lands were also at issue, Richard de Tonbridge, Hugh de Montfort, William de Arsic, Haimo the Viscount, and many others representing both the Norman secular nobility and the ecclesiastical hierarchy. The presence of such a large and distinguished assembly gave the proceedings weight and legitimacy. Whatever was decided here would have the endorsement of the kingdom's leadership and could not easily be challenged or ignored. The charges against Odo were laid out systematically. Lanfranc's representatives presented documents, charters, grants, and other records, proving Canterbury's historical ownership of specific estates and properties. They called witnesses who testified about how these lands had been held before the conquest, about the rents and services they had produced for Canterbury, about the circumstances under which they had been transferred away from church control after the Norman invasion. Old Ethelric, brought forth in his chariot, provided crucial testimony about English legal customs and historical precedents. He explained the difference between lands held outright by the church and those held by laymen on behalf of the church. He clarified complex questions about how estates had been granted, what obligations they carried, and what rights Canterbury had possessed that should still be respected under Norman rule. His testimony carried enormous authority because everyone present knew that he had no personal stake in the outcome. He was too old to benefit from whatever decision was reached, and his knowledge of English law was unimpeachable. Odo's defense seems to have been that he had not seized these lands unjustly, but had simply taken possession of properties that were vacant or whose ownership was unclear in the chaos following the conquest. He apparently argued that some of these lands had been held by English nobles who fought against William at Hastings, and that their properties were therefore forfeit to the crown, from which he had received them as legitimate grants. He may have suggested that other properties had been illegally acquired by English churches during the disorders of previous reigns, and that he was merely correcting historical injustices. But as testimony proceeded over 3 long days of legal argument, document examination, and witness interrogation, Odo's position became increasingly untenable. The evidence against him was substantial and difficult to refute. Canterbury could demonstrate through multiple types of proof: written documents, witness testimony, physical evidence like boundary markers and charter stones, and the authoritative statements of men like Ethelric, that these disputed lands had belonged to the church long before the conquest, through grants that were perfectly legal under English law. The fact that English nobles might have been stewarding these lands on behalf of the church, or that some nobles who held church lands had fought at Hastings, did not give Odo the right to claim the lands as his own. Church endowments were protected by both English and Norman law, blessed by religious authority, held in perpetuity for the salvation of souls and the support of God's work. Even if the nobles who had managed these properties lost their own personal holdings through rebellion, they could not forfeit church lands that had never been theirs to begin with. Finally, after 3 days of proceedings, Geoffrey de Montbray rendered judgment in King William's name. Odo was guilty of having unlawfully seized church properties. He was ordered to return numerous estates and holdings to Canterbury and Rochester, a decision that cost him a significant portion of his wealth and income, though he remained enormously rich even after these restitutions. The trial at Penenden Heath is regarded by historians as one of the most important events in early English legal history, significant far beyond its immediate impact on the property holdings of one powerful earl. It demonstrated several crucial principles that would shape England's legal development for centuries to come. First, it established that Norman rule would be conducted according to law, not merely arbitrary force. William was claiming to be the legitimate king of England, ruling by right rather than by conquest alone. If his rule was to have legitimacy, it had to respect legal procedures and principles, even when applying them was inconvenient or costly for the king's supporters. Second, the trial showed that English legal customs and property rights would be respected and incorporated into the emerging Norman English legal system. By calling Ethelric to testify about English law, by examining pre-conquest charters and documents, by accepting English witnesses as authoritative on questions of English custom, the court acknowledged that the conquest had not simply erased English law and replaced it wholesale with Norman customs. Third, and perhaps most importantly, the trial demonstrated that even the most powerful nobles could be held accountable under law. Odo was not just any earl. He was the king's own half-brother, one of the heroes of Hastings, the regent who governed England in the king's absence, the second most powerful man in the kingdom. Yet, he had been called before a court, found guilty of wrongdoing, and ordered to make restitution. The principle that no one was above the law, that even royal relatives could be held to account, was established in dramatic fashion. For Odo personally, the trial was a humiliating setback and a warning that his power had limits. He had been publicly called to account, found guilty before an assembly of the kingdom's most important figures, and forced to surrender property he had come to regard as his own. His reputation suffered, particularly among churchmen, who now saw him confirmed as someone who had attempted to rob the church while simultaneously claiming the privileges and status of a bishop. Yet it's important to note what the trial did not do. It did not strip Odo of his earldom or his bishopric. It did not imprison him or drive him from power. It checked his acquisitiveness and rebuked his methods, but it left him still enormously wealthy, still Earl of Kent, still Bishop of Bayeux, still the second most powerful man in England after the king. The trial had established limits on his power, but within those limits, Odo remained a formidable figure who continued to play a crucial role in governing Norman England. In the years immediately following the trial at Penenden Heath, Odo seems to have moderated his behavior somewhat, perhaps having learned that there were consequences for overreaching even for someone of his exalted status. He continued to serve as regent when William was in Normandy, continued to perform his duties as Earl of Kent, and Bishop of Bayeux, continued to be involved in the governance of the Anglo-Norman realm that was emerging from the conquest. It was during this period, in the mid to late 1070s, that Odo commissioned the creation of the work for which he would ultimately be best remembered by history, the Bayeux Tapestry. This remarkable embroidered chronicle of the Norman conquest would prove to be Odo's most enduring legacy, outlasting all his political achievements, surviving nearly 1,000 years to remain one of the most important medieval artworks in existence, and one of the most valuable historical sources for understanding the events of 1066, the Bayeux Tapestry, which is not actually a woven tapestry, but rather an embroidery made of coloured woolen thread stitched onto linen cloth, stretches nearly 70 meters in length, and stands approximately half a meter tall. It depicts the events leading up to the Norman conquest in a series of scenes arranged sequentially, telling the story like a medieval comic strip or an ancient film. The narrative begins with King Edward the Confessor sending Harold Godwinson to Normandy in 1064, shows Harold's controversial oath to William, depicts the preparation of the Norman invasion fleet, portrays the crossing of the Channel, and culminates in the Battle of Hastings itself, shown in graphic and detailed combat scenes. While the tapestry is never explicitly identified in medieval sources as being commissioned by Odo, virtually all modern scholars believe he was its patron based on multiple pieces of converging evidence. First, and most obviously, Odo himself appears prominently in the tapestry, depicted multiple times and always clearly labelled by name. He is shown blessing the feast before the battle, advising William during planning sessions, and rallying troops during the fighting, given more prominence than any figure except William himself and Harold. This emphasis on Odo's role suggests that whoever commissioned the tapestry wanted to ensure his contribution to the conquest was prominently remembered. Second, 3 minor figures who appear in the tapestry, Wadad, Vital, and Turold, are known from the Domesday Book to have been Odo's tenants in Kent, men who held land from him and owed him feudal service. Their inclusion in a tapestry depicting events where thousands of Normans participated, when only a few dozen individuals are actually named, strongly suggests a connection to Odo, who ensured his own followers were memorialized alongside the great figures of the conquest. Third, the tapestry was certainly in Bayeux Cathedral by 1476, when it appears in the cathedral's inventory. While this is 4 centuries after the conquest, the most logical explanation for how it came to be at Bayeux is that Odo commissioned it specifically for display in his cathedral, probably for the dedication ceremony in 1077, when the rebuilt cathedral was finally consecrated, or shortly thereafter. The tapestry was almost certainly created in England rather than Normandy, probably in Canterbury, which was famous throughout medieval Europe for the quality of its embroidery work. The Anglo-Saxon tradition of textile art, known as Opus Anglicanum, was already centuries old by 1066 and was renowned for its sophistication and beauty. The skilled embroiderers of Canterbury, likely women working in organized workshops, though medieval sources rarely recorded the names of craftswomen, would have been the obvious choice for such an ambitious project. Creating the tapestry would have required extraordinary planning and coordination. Someone, perhaps a monk or cleric with historical knowledge and artistic vision, would have designed the overall narrative, deciding which scenes to include, how to arrange them sequentially, what Latin inscriptions to add explaining the action. This designer would have created detailed drawings showing what each scene should look like, where figures should be positioned, what the Latin text should say. Then, the embroiderers would have executed this design, using 9 different colors of woolen yarn to create the images through stitching on the linen backing. The work was painstaking and time-consuming. Every figure, every horse, every ship, every piece of armor had to be individually stitched using techniques like stem stitch, chain stitch, and laden couched work. The project must have taken months or even years to complete, requiring multiple skilled workers laboring under careful supervision to maintain consistency in style and quality across the entire length of the work. The tapestry tells the story of the conquest from a distinctly Norman perspective, as one would expect from a work commissioned by Odo. Harold is depicted as an oath-breaker whose claim to the English throne is illegitimate, someone who violated sacred vows sworn on holy relics. William is shown as the righteous claimant pursuing what is properly his, a just warrior punishing perjury and enforcing the promises made to him. The battle is presented as a victory of Norman skill, courage, and divine favor over English stubbornness and Harold's moral failings. Throughout the tapestry, Odo's presence serves as a reminder that he was there, that he played a crucial role, that he deserves to be remembered alongside his more famous half-brother. The tapestry is, in this sense, both historical record and propaganda, both documentary evidence and self-aggrandizement. It presents the conquest as Odo wanted it to be remembered, emphasizing Norman valor and suggesting that God himself favored their cause, as evidenced by their ultimate victory. Yet for all its biases and its propagandistic elements, the Bayeux Tapestry remains an invaluable historical source. Its depictions of 11th century ships, weapons, armor, clothing, architecture, and warfare provide details about medieval life that we could not obtain any other way. Historians studying everything from medieval military tactics to the design of Norman castles, from the appearance of Halley's Comet, which appears in the tapestry, having been visible in 1066, as it is every 76 years, to the methods of medieval embroidery, have found the tapestry an inexhaustible source of information. The tapestry was displayed in Bayeux Cathedral, probably hung along the nave walls during special occasions and religious festivals, then carefully stored the rest of the year to protect it from damage. For centuries, it remained in the cathedral, known to locals and scholars, but not widely famous beyond Normandy. It survived wars, the potential ravages of time, and multiple close calls with destruction that would have robbed the world of this unique medieval treasure. In July of 1077, when the rebuilt Bayeux Cathedral was finally completed and ready for formal consecration, Odo presided over the ceremony in person. King William attended, along with Queen Matilda, their sons, and numerous other dignitaries from both Normandy and England. The cathedral was magnificent, a testament to Odo's wealth and his patronage of ecclesiastical architecture. And quite possibly, the Bayeux Tapestry was displayed for the first time during these ceremonies, telling the story of how William and his followers, including Odo so prominently, had conquered England. But in 1077, as the cathedral was consecrated and the tapestry perhaps unveiled, Odo's story was far from over. Indeed, the most dramatic and tumultuous period of his life still lay ahead. For within just 5 years, Odo would make a decision so reckless, so contrary to his half-brother's interests, that it would destroy their relationship, cost Odo everything he had gained, and send him from the heights of power to years of imprisonment. The year 1082 began like many others for Odo. He was still Earl of Kent, still Bishop of Bayeux, still one of the most powerful men in the Anglo-Norman realm. His vast estates generated enormous wealth that he used to maintain a princely household of knights, officials, and servants. His position gave him influence over both secular and ecclesiastical affairs. When King William was in Normandy, Odo governed significant portions of England with near royal authority. But something was stirring in Odo's ambitious mind. Some plan, some scheme, some new venture that he believed would elevate him to even greater heights. The exact details of what Odo was planning remain somewhat unclear, even after 9 centuries of historical study, shrouded in the conflicting accounts of chroniclers who wrote decades later with their own biases and agendas. What is certain is that Odo began gathering an army and making preparations for a military expedition to Italy. He recruited knights from his own estates, promising them glory and plunder. He persuaded others to join his venture, using his wealth and influence to assemble a substantial military force. He stockpiled provisions, arranged for ships, made contacts with various parties in Italy, all without King William's knowledge or authorization. When word of these preparations reached William, who was in Normandy dealing with French pressure on his duchy's borders, the king was absolutely furious. An unauthorized military expedition by one of his most powerful vassals was not merely an act of disobedience. It was a potentially catastrophic threat to everything William had built. If Odo marched an army to Italy, he would be stripping England of military forces needed to maintain Norman control over a still hostile population. Moreover, whatever Odo's aims in Italy might be, they could easily draw the Anglo-Norman realm into conflicts that William had not approved and did not want. William immediately crossed the Channel and moved against Odo with decisive speed. The confrontation was dramatic and personal. According to chroniclers, William personally arrested his half-brother, perhaps intercepting him at the Isle of Wight, as Odo was preparing to board ships for Italy. The king had Odo seized, bound, and taken into custody. A stunning fall for a man who just days before had been exercising vice-regal authority over England. But the arrest immediately created a serious legal problem. Odo was not just an earl who could be tried and punished according to secular law. He was also a bishop, an ordained member of the clergy, who technically could only be judged by ecclesiastical authorities. Canon law, the law of the church, held that secular rulers could not imprison or punish bishops without authorization from the Pope. For William to arrest and imprison Odo was potentially a violation of fundamental church law that could provoke conflict with the papacy. According to a famous story preserved by the chronicler Orderic Vitalis, when Archbishop Lanfranc pointed out this legal difficulty to William, suggesting diplomatically that the king could not simply imprison a bishop, William replied with characteristic bluntness, "I am not seizing the Bishop of Bayeux, but the Earl of Kent." In other words, William was claiming to punish Odo in his secular capacity as Earl for secular crimes, not touching his ecclesiastical status as bishop. It was a clever legal distinction that allowed William to proceed, while maintaining at least the appearance of respecting church law. Chroniclers writing a generation or more after these events claimed to know Odo's true motive for the Italian expedition. According to these later accounts, Odo had heard a prophecy or prediction that the next pope after Gregory VII would be named Odo. Taking this as a sign of his destiny, he planned to march to Rome with an army and seize the papal throne by force during the chaos of the investiture controversy. The bitter conflict between the papacy and the Holy Roman Emperor over who had the right to appoint bishops and other church officials. This story has the dramatic quality of a morality tale. The proud bishop who grasped for the highest office in Christendom and was struck down for his presumption. But whether it's entirely true is questionable. Contemporary evidence from 1082 itself doesn't mention papal ambitions, speaking only of an unauthorized military expedition. It's possible that later writers embellished the story to make Odo's fall seem even more dramatic and his punishment more deserved. creating a neat narrative of ambition leading to downfall. Regardless of his exact motives, Odo was imprisoned. William had him taken to Rouen in Normandy, where he was held in close confinement. His English estates were confiscated and reverted to the crown. His title as Earl of Kent was stripped away. Everything he had gained over 16 years of loyal service to his half-brother, the lands, the income, the power, the influence, vanished in a matter of weeks. Significantly, though, William did not depose Odo from his position as Bishop of Bayeux. That office, being ecclesiastical, was technically beyond royal authority to remove. Odo would remain imprisoned for the next 5 years, from 1082 to 1087. These were years of frustration and impotence for a man who had become accustomed to wielding immense power, who had governed kingdoms and commanded armies, who had accumulated wealth beyond the dreams of most nobles. Now he was reduced to waiting in confinement, while the world moved on without him. Medieval prisons for nobility were not the hellish dungeons of popular imagination, at least not for high-ranking prisoners whose families might seek vengeance for mistreatment. Odo would have been held in reasonably comfortable conditions, provided with adequate food, permitted to have servants, allowed to correspond with supporters. But he was denied the one thing that mattered most: freedom to act, to exercise power, to pursue his ambitions. During these years of imprisonment, Odo had ample time to contemplate his life, the extraordinary rise from minor noble's son to one of the most powerful men in Europe, the heights of power and wealth he had achieved, the dramatic fall that had cost him nearly everything. He could reflect on what mistakes he had made, what hubris had led him to attempt an unauthorized expedition that his half-brother would inevitably learn about and oppose. The chronicles suggest that William remained angry with Odo throughout the imprisonment. At one point, when someone suggested that the king might release his half-brother, William reportedly responded with a bitter condemnation of Odo's character. The king described Odo as a man not to be trusted, ambitious, given to fleshly desires, and of dire cruelty. He claimed that Odo will never be converted from whoredoms and ruinous follies. William even argued that releasing Odo would result in the ruin of thousands, suggesting that he saw his half-brother as fundamentally dangerous and uncontrollable. This harsh assessment, whether entirely fair or coloured by William's anger at feeling betrayed by someone he had trusted so completely, reflected real concerns. Odo was indeed ambitious, perhaps recklessly so, willing to risk everything for the chance at greater power. He had demonstrated a capacity for acquiring wealth through means that others found troubling. He seemed far more interested in worldly success than in the spiritual responsibilities of his bishopric. From William's perspective, keeping Odo imprisoned was not vindictive punishment, but necessary precaution to protect the realm from someone whose ambition exceeded his judgment. Yet family bonds, even strained ones, are difficult to break entirely, and as William's health began to fail in 1087, pressure mounted on him to release his half-brother. Robert, Count of Mortain, Odo's younger brother and William's other half-brother, interceded repeatedly on Odo's behalf. Robert argued that Odo had been punished enough, that 5 years of imprisonment had surely taught him the cost of disobedience, that family loyalty should ultimately prevail over political calculation. Other voices joined Robert's pleas. Some of William's counsellors suggested that mercy toward Odo might be seen as magnanimous, a sign of strength rather than weakness. Religious advisors reminded the king that forgiveness was a Christian virtue, that a king on his deathbed should concern himself with the state of his immortal soul, that holding grudges into eternity was spiritually dangerous. Whatever Odo's faults, he was still William's half-brother. bound by blood ties that medieval people took very seriously. In early September 1087, William was campaigning near Montes in France when disaster struck. His horse stumbled and threw him forward against the iron pommel of his saddle, causing serious internal injuries. Medieval medicine could do nothing for such trauma, and it quickly became clear that the Conqueror was dying. He was carried to Rouen, where he lay in agony, his body broken, death approaching inexorably. During his final days, as William made arrangements for the succession and for the disposition of his domains, as he confessed his sins and sought spiritual preparation for death, Robert of Mortain pressed him once again to release Odo. William resisted at first, reiterating his belief that Odo was dangerous and would cause trouble if freed. But Robert was insistent, and others joined their voices to his. Finally, reluctantly, perhaps seeking to ease his conscience as death approached, William agreed. Odo was brought from his prison cell to William's deathbed. The dying king, with great difficulty and evident reluctance, granted his half-brother his freedom. It was an act of mercy, perhaps, or simply an acknowledgement that even the Conqueror's will could not reach beyond the grave, that he could no longer control what Odo might do after his death. William the Conqueror died on September 9, 1087. He was approximately 60 years old and had ruled Normandy since childhood, England for 21 years. His death created an immediate succession crisis, for William had chosen to divide his domains between two of his sons, rather than keeping them unified under a single ruler. To Robert Curthose, his eldest surviving son, William left the Duchy of Normandy. Robert had been designated heir to Normandy years earlier, and now assumed full independent control of the duchy. To William Rufus, his second surviving son, his third son overall, but the second who survived to adulthood, William left the Kingdom of England. Rufus was crowned King William II at Westminster on September 26, 1087, barely more than 2 weeks after his father's death. This division of the Anglo-Norman realm created precisely the kind of instability that William the Conqueror had spent his life trying to prevent. Nobles who held lands in both Normandy and England now faced an impossible dilemma. They owed feudal loyalty to both rulers, but if Robert and William Rufus came into conflict, as everyone expected they would, those nobles would have to choose one lord or the other. Whichever choice they made, they risked losing their estates on the other side of the Channel. Odo, newly released from prison and eager to rebuild his fortunes, saw opportunity in this situation. Robert Curthose was known to be weak-willed, easily influenced, lacking his father's strength of personality and political skill. If Odo could become one of Robert's chief advisors, he might regain in Normandy the power and influence he had lost in England. More than that, if Robert could be persuaded to invade England and unite the two domains under his rule, Odo might return to England in triumph, recovering his earldom and estates. With this plan in mind, Odo returned to England in late 1087 or early 1088. He still had some property interests in England through his position as Bishop of Bayeux, which gave him a legitimate reason to cross the Channel. But his return was not merely to tend to ecclesiastical business. Odo immediately began building a conspiracy to overthrow William Rufus and replace him with Robert Curthose, reuniting England and Normandy under a single ruler. The new king had made strategic mistakes that gave the conspiracy fertile ground. William Rufus had inherited his father's ruthless capability, but lacked his political wisdom and instinct for when to be harsh and when to show mercy. He was prickly, suspicious, and alienated potential supporters through his harsh manner and his open contempt for those he considered his inferiors. Many Norman nobles who held lands on both sides of the Channel were genuinely worried about the division of the realm, and could be persuaded that reunification under Robert was in their best interests. Odo used his considerable powers of persuasion and his reputation as one of the heroes of the conquest to build a formidable coalition. He convinced his younger brother Robert of Mortain to join the conspiracy, bringing Robert's extensive estates and military forces to the rebellion. He brought in Geoffrey of Coutances, the Bishop of Coutances, who had presided over Odo's trial at Penenden Heath years before. Apparently, that experience had not destroyed their working relationship. Roger of Montgomery, Earl of Shrewsbury, one of the most powerful magnates in England, committed his forces to the cause. Robert de Mowbray, Earl of Northumberland, pledged support. Even Count Eustace III of Boulogne, with substantial resources on the continent, joined the conspiracy. By the spring of 1088, Odo had assembled a rebel coalition that was truly formidable. Of the 10 largest landholders in England according to the Domesday Book, 6 were now counted among the rebels. The conspirators controlled vast territories spread across England. Kent under Odo's influence, Northumberland under Robert de Mowbray, extensive lands throughout the west, and Midlands under Roger of Montgomery and Geoffrey of Coutances. If Robert Curthose landed with an army from Normandy as planned, William Rufus might be quickly overwhelmed. The rebellion began around Easter of 1088, which fell on April 16th that year. The rebels activated their castles, strengthening defences, stockpiling provisions, calling up their military vassals and preparing for war. The plan was for Odo and the other English rebels to create chaos and disorder throughout England, forcing William Rufus to divide his forces to respond to multiple threats, while Robert Curthose brought an invasion fleet across the Channel with reinforcements that would deliver the decisive blow. Odo established his headquarters at Rochester Castle in Kent, one of the strongest fortifications in England, and strategically positioned to control movement between London and the coast. His brother Robert of Mortain fortified Pevensey Castle in Sussex, ironically, the very place where William the Conqueror had first landed 22 years earlier. From these strongholds, the rebels began operations designed to demonstrate that William Rufus could not maintain control, attacking royal estates and properties of nobles who remained loyal to the king. But the rebellion was far from universally popular, even among Norman nobles. Some remembered that William the Conqueror had given them everything they possessed, and they felt obligated to support his designated heir. Others calculated that William Rufus, despite his youth and abrasive personality, had the resources of the English crown behind him and would likely prevail. And crucially, Archbishop Lanfranc, still the most respected churchman in England, threw his support behind William Rufus, giving the king the moral authority of the church's backing. William Rufus proved to be a more capable opponent than the rebels had anticipated. He adopted a clever three-pronged strategy that would ultimately defeat the rebellion. First, he tried to split the rebel coalition by offering generous rewards to those who abandoned the rebellion: land, money, royal favour, pardons for their participation. This had some effect, particularly on nobles, who were not deeply committed to Robert Curthose's cause and who could be bought off with concrete benefits. Second, and more surprisingly, William Rufus made an extraordinary appeal directly to the English people. He promised the English better laws and governance than his father had provided, essentially pledging to relax some of the harsh restrictions and heavy taxation that the Conqueror had imposed. This brilliant political move won him crucial support from English furred troops and English nobles, who had accepted Norman rule, casting the rebellion as a Norman civil war in which the English population actually had a stake in supporting the current king. Third, William moved militarily against the rebel strongholds with impressive speed and determination. He marched first against Pevensey Castle, besieging Robert of Mortaine's garrison. Without relief from outside, the castle eventually began to run short of supplies. Then William turned north against Rochester, where Odo commanded the main rebel force in what would prove to be the decisive confrontation of the entire rebellion. The siege of Rochester was the critical moment. If Odo could hold out until Robert Curthose arrived with reinforcements from Normandy, the rebellion might yet succeed. England and Normandy might be reunited, and Odo might regain everything he had lost. But day after day passed, and no Norman fleet appeared on the horizon. Robert Curthose, displaying the indecisiveness and lack of follow-through that would characterize his entire career, had failed to act. He had prepared ships but hesitated to commit to the invasion. When he finally did send ships, they were driven back by storms in the English Channel. Without Robert Curthose's army, the rebellion was doomed. The rebels at Rochester found themselves isolated, besieged by superior forces, with no hope of relief. William Rufus's troops surrounded the castle, cutting off all supplies and communication with the outside world. Inside Rochester, as provisions dwindled and hope faded, the rebels began to argue among themselves about whether to continue fighting or seek terms of surrender. After weeks of siege, Odo and the other rebel leaders were forced to face reality. Robert Curthose was not coming, their rebellion had failed, and they were now at William Rufus's mercy. They negotiated a surrender, and the king granted them terms that, while not generous, at least did not include execution. William's own nobles urged him to show some mercy, arguing that the rebels were powerful men whose continued cooperation would be more valuable than their deaths. For Odo personally, the terms of surrender were devastating. He was stripped of all his English properties. Everything he had managed to retain or recover after his previous imprisonment was now gone permanently. He was banished from England for life, forbidden ever to return. William Rufus's more militant supporters had wanted Odo hanged as a traitor and rebel, but the king, whether from political calculation or some lingering family feeling, refused to go that far. In the summer of 1088, Odo left England for the last time. He crossed the Channel back to Normandy, now a man approaching 60 years old, his great career of power and influence largely behind him. He still held his bishopric of Bayeux. That, at least, could not be taken from him by secular authority. But his dreams of recovering his position in England, of becoming once again the second most powerful man in the kingdom, were finished forever. Odo took up residence in Normandy, where he became an advisor to Robert Curthose. Robert was Duke of Normandy, but lacked the strength to control his fractious nobles effectively. He needed experienced counselors, and Odo, for all his faults and failures, had decades of experience in governance and warfare. So Odo found a modest role in Robert's court, though it was a pale shadow of the power he had once wielded in England. The years passed quietly. Odo attended ducal councils, advised on various matters, presumably continued to perform at least the minimal functions of his bishopric at Bayeux. He was aging now, entering his 60s, an old man by medieval standards. He might have lived out the rest of his days in this reduced but respectable position, remembered as an important figure in the Norman conquest, but ultimately a cautionary tale about the dangers of overreaching ambition. But then, in November of 1095, an event occurred that would give Odo one final opportunity for glory, one last great adventure that might allow him to die with honor and perhaps achieve some redemption for his failures. Pope Urban II called a church council at Clermont in central France, and Odo attended. What he heard there would change the course of the rest of his life. Pope Urban delivered a sermon calling for a great military expedition to the east, a crusade to liberate Jerusalem and the Holy Land from Muslim control. Urban spoke movingly of the suffering of Eastern Christians, of the difficulties facing pilgrims who wished to visit the holy sites, of the duty of Christian warriors to defend their faith. He promised spiritual rewards, remission of sins, divine favor, eternal glory for those who fought in God's cause. This was the beginning of what would later be called the First Crusade. To Odo, listening to Urban's words, it must have seemed like a final chance for redemption and glory. Here was a cause worthy of a warrior bishop, a chance to serve God while also achieving military fame. At approximately 65 years old, Odo was certainly elderly by medieval standards, but he had not lost his vigor or his desire for one more great achievement. Robert Curthose also took the cross, pledging to lead a Norman contingent on crusade. This created an opportunity for reconciliation between Robert and his brother William Rufus. Robert desperately needed money to finance his crusade, while William wanted to secure Normandy during Robert's absence. They negotiated an arrangement. William would provide Robert with 10,000 marks, an enormous sum, in exchange for Robert mortgaging the duchy to William for the duration of the crusade. Odo aligned himself with Robert's crusading expedition. As Bishop of Bayeux, and as one of the veterans of the Norman conquest, his participation lent prestige to Robert's contingent. He began preparations for the journey, assembling a household of knights who would accompany him, gathering provisions, putting his affairs at Bayeux in order for what would be a prolonged absence. In September of 1096, Robert's contingent finally departed from Normandy. Odo was with them, an old man embarking on the greatest journey of his life, a pilgrimage of thousands of miles to the Holy Land, through territories both Christian and Muslim, facing dangers from weather, disease, bandits, and hostile armies. The crusading army made its way south through France and into Italy. This was not a rapid military march, but a slow procession, as the army had to arrange for supplies and accommodation in each territory through which it passed. As they traveled through Italy, moving toward the southern ports where they would take ship across the Mediterranean, Odo's health began to deteriorate. The rigors of constant travel, the exposure to weather, the physical demands of the journey, all took their toll on his aging body. By the time Robert's army reached southern Italy, heading toward Palermo in Sicily, where they planned to embark for the east, Odo was gravely ill. Palermo was ruled by Roger III of Sicily, a Norman lord and someone who knew of Odo's reputation. When word reached Roger that the famous Bishop of Bayeux, one of the conquerors of England, was dying in his territory, Roger offered hospitality and ensured that Odo received the best care available. But it was not enough. In January or February of 1097, Bishop Odo of Bayeux died in Palermo. He was approximately 67 years old. He had lived through one of the most tumultuous periods in medieval European history, had risen to extraordinary heights of power and fallen to imprisonment and exile, had participated in events that would shape England and European civilization for centuries to come. Roger of Sicily, along with Gilbert, Bishop of Evreux, who was also with the crusading army, arranged for Odo to be buried with honor. He was interred in Palermo Cathedral, a fitting resting place for a bishop who had spent his life as much in secular as in sacred pursuits. A tomb was erected, though it no longer survives in identifiable form. Odo never reached Jerusalem. He never saw the Holy Land for whose liberation he had embarked on his final journey. He died before the Crusaders even reached Constantinople, let alone face the battles that would eventually lead to the capture of Jerusalem in 1099. In this, as in much of his life, Odo's ambitions exceeded his achievement. News of Odo's death would have reached Normandy and England months later. For William Rufus, it meant the permanent removal of a potential threat. For Robert Curthose, it meant the loss of an experienced advisor. For the people of Bayeux, it meant they would need a new bishop to succeed the man who had governed their diocese for nearly 50 years. The cathedral Odo had rebuilt would be destroyed by fire in 1105, just 8 years after his death, reducing his architectural legacy to ruins. The estates he had accumulated were long since dispersed to others. The power he had wielded was transferred to new men. Within a generation, Odo of Bayeux would be largely forgotten, except by historians and chroniclers recording the Norman conquest. But the tapestry survived. The Bayeux Tapestry remained in the cathedral, preserved through centuries, surviving wars and revolutions. During the French Revolution, it nearly became wagon covers for military carts, but was saved by a local lawyer. Napoleon would display it as propaganda. Eventually, it would find its home in a special museum, where it remains today, one of the most important medieval artworks in existence. And in that tapestry, Odo lives still. There he stands at the feast, blessing the meal before battle. There he rides among the troops, club in hand, encouraging the warriors. There he sits beside William, counselor to the Conqueror. For a man whose earthly power was stripped away before his death, who died in exile from the land where he had been so mighty, this tapestry became his most enduring legacy. So rest now, dear listener, as we close this long tale of Bishop Odo of Bayeux. Let his story of ambition and achievement, of power gained and lost, of the warrior bishop who helped conquer a kingdom and commissioned a masterpiece that would outlast empires, drift gently through your consciousness as sleep embraces you. May you find peace in these quiet hours, cradled by history's whispers from a distant medieval world. Good night, and sleep peacefully.